Greetings, fellow time travelers. Tonight I'm reporting from the unforgiving heart of a medieval winter, right in the thick of peasant survival mode. These folks, the unsung champions of chilly nights, didn't just endure some of the most merciless cold in history. They stared it down with a mix of stubbornness, creativity, and a surprising amount of mud. Before you settle in with your heated blanket, do me a favor, if you're enjoying these historical field reports, tap that like button, subscribe for more, and very important, drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to see if anyone's tuning in from a place colder than this medieval hovel. Now, dim your lights, maybe fire up a fan for that authentic drafty ambience, and let's slip back in time together. Forget the chivalric tournaments and endless feasts you see in the movies. For most people, medieval winter wasn't about singing carols or donning festive hats. It was about surviving the night without turning into a human icicle. Winter wasn't a season, it was a merciless annual challenge. Think of it as an escape room designed by someone with a grudge against toes. Imagine this. You're crammed into a mud and stick hut, so compact you could practically eavesdrop on conversations happening on the other side of the village. The walls are so thin you're convinced you could see your own breath drifting right through them. Forget glass windows. If you're lucky, you might have a hole patched with some animal skin, more draft than barrier. Thermostat? Please. If you want to get warmer, your best bet is to stand closer to the livestock. Inside, the temperature is only marginally improved, maybe a couple degrees above the outdoor chill, and that's on a good day. If it's freezing outside, it's slightly less freezing within. Welcome to Luxury Medieval Edition. Nights, that's when the real fun began. Darkness pressed in from all sides, the wind shrieked like a banshee, and the tiny hearth fire, more symbolic than effective, guttered bravely. If you were lucky enough to snag a spot nearby, you'd feel a faint warmth on your shins. Everyone else might as well set up camp outside, minus the novelty. Clothing was another exercise in disappointment. No plush coats or fluffy blankets here. You had a couple of coarse wool tunics, maybe a cloak that had clearly lost a wrestling match with a goat, and a desperate hope that layering would transform you into a medieval onion. Spoiler, onions are only slightly less cold. Bedding? Think hay-stuffed sacks, maybe sprinkled with rushes and the occasional flea. Congratulations, you've achieved peak peasant comfort. The cold wasn't just inconvenient, it was actively plotting against you. Frostbite, hypothermia, and the general possibility of not waking up were everyday threats, especially for children and elders. Every morning you woke up still breathing was a minor victory. If your breakfast turnip was only half frozen, you might even crack a smile. The relentless winter wasn't about comfort, it was about resilience, piling on every scrap of cloth, huddling with family and livestock, and praying your eyebrows didn't freeze into icicles overnight. And trust me, the adventure was only just getting started. If you complain about your apartment's drafty windows, medieval peasants would like a word. Their dwellings weren't just drafty, they were basically wind tunnels with a dirt theme. Most homes were built with what historians call wattle and daub, which is a polite way of saying sticks, mud, straw, and a generous helping of animal dung. Yes, dung. Not a design choice, just a matter of survival. Dung was sticky, cheap, and believe it or not, added a bit of insulation, always on hand too. But no matter how lovingly you smeared the stuff, a real winter storm would find its way in. Every crevice and gap turned into a cold highway, and the wind would gleefully swirl through your home, making sure you never got too warm or too complacent. Privacy? None. Warmth? Debatable. Character building? Absolutely. Let's talk roofs. Thatched roofs look charming in storybooks, but after months of rain and snow, they sagged, leaked, and occasionally hosted local wildlife. Nothing says cozy like a squirrel joining you for supper. Windows, if you could call them that, were usually tiny holes covered with animal hides or boards. Glass? Ha! That was for the 1%. Most peasants were just pleased if the wind didn't rip the covering clean off during a blizzard. And then there was the floor, or should I say the ground. No floorboards here, just the same compacted dirt you walked on outside, now slightly flatter and slightly less forgiving. If it rained or snowed, mud seeped up from below, so you could technically claim your home had indoor water features, not that anyone was impressed. Every step was a squelchy reminder of nature's enthusiasm. In winter, the cold assaulted you from every angle, above, below, within. It was a three-pronged attack on your morale and your body heat. But peasants weren't the type to sit around moaning. They stuffed gaps with moss, wedged rags into the worst drafts, and huddled together for dear life. If there was a talent show for human insulation, medieval peasants would win, hands down. Sometimes, a bit of sheep grease rubbed into the walls was the only thing between you and becoming a medieval popsicle. Because when your house is actively falling apart, and your best hope is a mixture of mud, dung, and goat hair, well, you either laugh about it, or your teeth chatter too hard to make any sound at all. The cold wasn't just in the air, it was rising from below like a villain no one invited. The ground inside your home was barely distinguishable from the ground outside, except maybe for the extra layer of misery. Maybe someone had scattered straw or rushes to create the illusion of comfort, but make no mistake, you were sleeping one thin insult away from the freezing dirt. The cold crept up from the earth like a ghost with a personal vendetta. Drop anything on the floor overnight, and congratulations, it's part of the permafrost now. Peasants fought back by layering the floor with thick straw if they could spare it. Or if you were cunning, you might borrow some from your neighbour's field. Just don't get caught. Straw flattened quickly, got mouldy even faster, and added a satisfying crunch to your nightly shivers. Some homes layered dried rushes on the dirt, tossing new ones on top of the old as the months dragged on. Over time, this created a living, breathing ecosystem of decomposing plants, adventurous insects, and mystery aromas. It was like medieval carpet padding, if your carpet was damp, alive, and always smelled faintly of wet dog. Beds didn't offer much relief. The lucky few with a frame filled it with more straw or hay, but this just meant more crunch, more cold, and more creative arrangements to keep your blood circulating. Tossing and turning wasn't about comfort. It was a desperate bid to avoid freezing one side of your body into a popsicle. Truth is, medieval peasants didn't conquer the frozen ground. They just learned to survive uncomfortably above it. A good night's sleep wasn't about dreams. It was about waking up with all your limbs still attached and mobile. Pull that off, and you were doing better than most. If there was a true hero in the peasant home, it wasn't the roof or the walls, and definitely not the dirt floor. It was the hearth, a modest but vital fire pit that stood as the final defense against the cold, the dark, and the general mood of medieval existence. At the heart of almost every home was this crackling, determined little fire. Forget grand stone fireplaces, this was just a pit, some rocks and a few charred logs, all valiantly producing heat and equally smoke. So much smoke, in fact, that you'd suspect the real goal was to gradually turn the entire family into smoked ham. Most homes didn't even have chimneys. Smoke found its own way out through holes in the roof, gaps in the daub, or most often straight into your lungs. It wasn't ideal for your breathing or your life expectancy, but on the plus side, nothing kills fleas and lice quite like an evening of involuntary fumigation. Who needs pest control when your living room doubles as a smokehouse? The hearth was more than just warmth. It was the kitchen, the light source, the medieval version of a television, and the social heart of the home. People gathered around to swap stories, gossip about neighbours, or just peer into the flames because honestly there weren't any other options once the sun went down. Keeping the fire alive overnight wasn't optional. Letting it die was basically inviting the cold to come in and finish you off. Rekindling a fire in winter wasn't a matter of flicking a lighter. It involved flint, steel, dry tinder, and a level of faith usually reserved for miracles. Everyone had a job tending the flames, watching the embers, and adding whatever fuel could be scrounged, peat, sticks, or, for the lucky, a precious chunk of dry wood. It was a nightly battle, human willpower versus the suffocating chill waiting to creep in. The hearth might not guarantee survival, but without it, your odds took a steep nosedive. It was a smoky, flickering, often underwhelming champion, but in a medieval winter, it was nothing less than the pulse of hope. So next time you grumble about a sibling stealing your blanket, remember at least you wine 19 wedged between a snoring uncle and a goat with boundary issues. So next time you grumble about your heating bill or drafty room, remember, somewhere a medieval peasant is rolling over in their hay-stuffed bed, congratulating you on your luxury. And if you've ever considered yourself a winter person, I challenge you to try it medieval style for a single night. Just kidding. Please don't. I'd rather not have to explain that one to the time travel authorities. But the real secret to surviving these nights wasn't just in the construction or the fire. Oh no, it was in the clever, communal, sometimes questionable tactics that peasants developed to keep the cold at bay. Because when the fire sputtered and the wind howled, you had to get creative. If there was one thing medieval peasants feared more than running out of ale, it was letting the fire go out overnight. But fire alone wasn't enough, so they turned to fire banking, communal sleeping, and even inviting the livestock in for a group cuddle. Stick around, because in the next chapter, we'll get up close and personal with the art of surviving winter nights, using every warm body, human or otherwise, available. If you ever find yourself dropped into the middle of a medieval village in January, and as a time-travelling historical fixer, I assure you, it's not as charming as the woodcuts suggest. The number one rule is simple: whatever you do, don't let the fire die. Forget about ale shortages or awkward encounters with the local reeve. The real terror lurking outside your thatched walls is the cold, a silent, creeping beast that can turn even the hardiest peasant into a medieval popsicle before sunrise. Imagine shivering in the black pre-dawn, clutching a bit of flint, desperately hoping your fingers still work well enough to coax a spark from stubborn steel. Matches, lighters, those are the fever dreams of centuries yet to come. Back here, it's all about determination, numb hands, and a little bit of luck. That's why the fine art of firebanking developed, one of those practical skills every parent passed down, right alongside how to spot a fake coin, or which mushrooms won't turn your breakfast into a psychedelic disaster. The secret: just before bed, you bury the glowing embers under a mound of ash, creating a makeshift insulation blanket. Done right, those embers smoulder quietly until morning, ready to burst back into flame with a little coaxing. Done wrong, and you're left with a frigid room, a sullen family, and a new candidate for the annual Who Let the House Freeze blame fest. Firebanking was less a science and more a delicate dance, a nightly argument in ash and ember. Some peasants swore by dry ash, others insisted a hint of dampness kept the fire alive. You could have started a medieval feud, just debating the merits of tight packing versus letting the embers breathe, the era's equivalent of arguing over the best barbecue rub, except the loser risked frostbite. And don't think the fire was ever truly safe. All it took was a gust of wind sneaking through a gap in the wattle, or a curious sheep deciding to investigate, and your precious heat was gone. That's why families often took shifts at night, rousing themselves to check the hearth. Picture it, a bleary-eyed peasant stumbling across the room, poking the ash with a stick, praying to find even a single glowing coal. It's the medieval version of tiptoeing to the thermostat at 3 a.m. Except instead of digital numbers, you're relying on hope and the faintest glimmer of red. But let's say you did it right, and you managed to coax a flicker from the ash at dawn. That's not just a win, it's a ticket to another day. In a world without central heating, firebanking wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. If your house stayed even a few degrees warmer through the night, you'd saved your family from another round of frozen toes, blue lips, and the kind of morning mood that makes even the cows nervous. Of course, fire could only do so much. For the real battle against winter's icy grip, medieval peasants relied on their ultimate secret weapon, each other. When the wind howled and the temperature dropped, there was only one rule: pile in and pile on. Privacy? That was a luxury for kings. For everyone else, the only thing between you and a night spent shivering was the warmth of other bodies. So, as the moon rose and the cottage darkened, families would crowd into the warmest corner, forming what can only be described as a snoring, wheezing, occasionally grumbling human lasagna. Layers upon layers of relatives, parents, children, grandparents, and the occasional neighbour who just happened to be passing by, all squeezed together in a desperate cuddle puddle. If you were lucky, you got the middle, cocooned in warmth. If you drew the short straw, you got the edge, bravely holding the line against drafts and the ever-present risk of waking up with your nose frozen to the wall. The phrase "the more the merrier" wasn't about parties, it was about not dying of exposure. Babies and elders were always sandwiched in the centre, the family's most precious heat generators. Stronger, hardier adults slept on the outside, acting as human insulation, sometimes literally sacrificing a night's comfort so the youngest and oldest could see another morning. As for bedding, well, expect nothing plush, maybe a communal straw mattress, flattened by generations, with a patchwork of scratchy blankets and whatever clothing wasn't being worn. The scent, let's just say spring cleaning, was less about dusting and more about fumigating the place. But it wasn't all grim. Long, cold nights huddled together bred a certain camaraderie, stories whispered in the dark, songs sung to stave off boredom, and the sort of inside jokes only possible when you've spent hours inhaling your cousin's foot aroma. So next time you grumble about a sibling stealing your blanket, remember, at least you aren't wedged between a snoring uncle and a goat with boundary issues. Speaking of goats, let's talk about livestock. If you think sharing a bedroom with your little brother is a challenge, try doing it with half the barnyard. When winter descended, medieval peasants didn't just invite family into the house, they brought in the animals too. Cows, goats, pigs, chickens. If it had a heartbeat and gave off even a whisper of warmth, it was welcomed by the hearth. Well, maybe not so much welcomed as conscripted. Bringing livestock indoors wasn't just a quirky tradition, it was survival science. Poorly insulated cottages lost heat faster than a modern apartment with broken windows, so every extra degree mattered. Cows, being the medieval equivalent of a portable radiator, were usually stationed closest to the humans, the better to share that luxurious, slightly damp bovine warmth. Goats wormed their way inside too. If you didn't let them in, they'd probably find a way anyway. Chickens roosted in the rafters or huddled in baskets, and pigs, always the divas, sprawled wherever they pleased. The result? Chaos, noise, and a smell so legendary that by March, you wouldn't just need to air out the house, you'd need to apologize to your neighbors. Imagine waking up to a chicken perched on your chest, a cow serenely chewing cud next to you, and a pig snoring louder than your grandfather. Medieval mornings were full of surprises, some more pungent than others, and yet the peasants endured. They developed the ability to filter out the barnyard bouquet, focusing instead on the simple equation, more animals inside equals fewer cases of frostbite. There was even a livestock hierarchy. Cows got prime spots naturally, bigger, warmer, and less likely to step on you in the night. Goats, as stubborn as their reputation, always managed to get close. Chickens, lighter and flightier, claimed whatever high ground they could find. Pigs, unconcerned with social niceties, claimed the middle of the room and dared anyone to move them. It was the original open-plan living, with a side of surprise livestock encounters. Of course, sharing your home with animals had its hazards. There's nothing quite like waking up to a chicken investigating your hair, or discovering that a pig has claimed your favorite sleeping spot, and stepping onto a cold floor first thing in the morning. That was an adventure, especially if you weren't sure what your feet might land in. Yet, despite the noise, the chaos, and the unmistakable ode to barnyard, medieval peasants understood the math. Cold kills, cows cuddle, and sometimes a goat curled up nearby is worth more than a dozen blankets. In the end, it wasn't about comfort, it was about surviving to see the spring, and maybe, if you were lucky, doing it all with most of your toes intact. So, next time your roommate complains about your questionable laundry habits, just smile and tell them it could be worse. At least neither of you woke up with a chicken on your chest or a pig hogging the heater. And remember, the next time you hear someone say back in the good old days, they probably never had to share a mattress with a goat who snored louder than the wind. The ingenious if pungent winter tactics of medieval villagers didn't end there. When it came to keeping warm, every layer counted, especially the ones you wore, slept under, or desperately stuffed into that drafty gap in the wall. In medieval winters, fashion wasn't about looking good. Let me set the scene. It's midwinter in a medieval English village, and the cold isn't just outside, it's everywhere. The wind howls like it has a personal vendetta, and even inside your home, each breath feels like a dare. If you're picturing peasants flipping through medieval Vogue for the latest in winter wear, let me stop you. Survival, not style, was the only trend anyone followed. The guiding principle: if it fits, you wear it. If it doesn't fit, you wear it anyway. Layering was less about fashion and more about engaging in a life-or-death tug-of-war with the elements. Picture this. You start with your trusty linen undertunic, which is about as soft as a sack of oats and maybe half as clean. Over that, you add a wool tunic, thick and heavy, its colour long since lost to mud and smoke. If you're especially fortunate or have recently bested a sheep in single combat, you sling a ragged sheepskin over your shoulders, your very own badge of medieval luxury. Leggings, loose and sagging, are pulled on next, followed by a cloak so patched it looks like a textile Frankenstein. The cumulative effect: 10% warmer, 90% itchier, and 100% committed to not becoming a medieval popsicle. Let's not forget the feet. Boots, for most, are the stuff of legend, something you might hear about from that one cousin who married up. For everyone else, it's layers of cloth, old rags, and if you're lucky, wooden clogs. If the icy ground still manages to reach your toes, you simply add another rag and pray you don't wake up with fewer digits than you went to bed with. Washing any of this? Unlikely. Doing laundry in medieval winter meant hauling your only shirt down to a frozen stream, hacking through the ice, and waiting for it to dry in the kind of weather that could turn a shirt into a medieval popsicle sculpture. Most peasants simply accepted the bouquet of sweat, smoke, and livestock as the cost of staying alive. Here's the plot twist. That dirt wasn't just a badge of hard living, it was a survival hack. Over time, a hearty layer of grime and grease built up on your clothes, effectively sealing the fabric against the wind. It's like wearing a medieval Gore-Tex jacket, but with a scent profile that would clear a tavern. The filth locked in precious body heat, and if anyone dared ask why you smelled like a sheep's bad day, you could answer, it's tactical. Headgear was the crown jewel of winter attire. A simple wool cap kept your ears from freezing into decorative icicles. Scarves and gloves, cobbled together from whatever scraps you could find, were coveted treasures. Gloves might look more like something you'd find in a child's puppet show, but even a sad pair was better than frostbite. Children, meanwhile, were bundled to the point of immobility, swaddled until they resembled root vegetables with eyes turnips, perhaps, if you're feeling poetic. The result of all this layering was a look that screamed, lumpy laundry bag, more than runway model. But warmth was the ultimate flex, and medieval peasants wore it proudly. So next time you grumble about putting on a second sweater, remember, peasants would have traded a month's worth of onions for your fleece-lined hoodie. Now, let's talk hygiene, or more accurately, the lack thereof. In the medieval playbook, dirt wasn't failure. It was function, fashion, and a barrier between you and a slow, chilly demise. The longer you went without washing your clothes, the more insulated they became. That crusty outer shell, it was your thermal armor. Clean linen might have felt nice for the first 5 minutes, but in a world where breathable fabric was code for you're about to freeze, it was a liability. Some folks even believed that bathing too often in winter could invite illness, so the holy filth barrier stayed put. Soap was a rare guest, reserved for special occasions, like the bishop's visit, or your own funeral. Most days you simply added new layers atop the old. Before long, you were a walking archive of the past 6 weeks, each stain and streak a badge of survival. To outsiders, it may have looked like you'd given up, but to a medieval peasant, this was strategy at its finest. The filthier you were by February, the better your odds of not waking up as a medieval ice sculpture. And really, who's going to judge you for smelling like a barnyard when everyone else does too? Nose blindness became a community pastime, so filth wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated in a grim, practical sort of way. If you were lucky enough to have a greasy, smoke-infused cloak by late winter, you were basically the village trendsetter. Let's move on to bedtime, another arena in the ongoing war against winter. If you imagine peasants snuggled in feather beds beneath embroidered quilts, you're thinking of the landlord, not the labourer. The peasant's bed was a masterpiece of improvisation, a wooden frame, if you could afford it, piled high with a sack of straw, hay or rushes. No memory foam. No orthopedics, just a lumpy, pokey heap that crackled with every toss and turn, exuding the subtle aroma of barn and regret. Some skipped the frame altogether, opting for the earth-connected slumber experience, just a heap of straw on the dirt floor. Influencers today might market this as grounding, but in the Middle Ages it was just called sleeping. The straw provided crucial insulation from the frozen earth, even as it flattened, moulded, and occasionally sprouted new life forms. Changing the straw was an event, undertaken only when your bedding began to host more tenants than your house. Rushes and herbs were sometimes added for extra comfort, or at least to mask the omnipresent scent of livestock. A fresh bed of rushes might offer a fleeting whiff of lavender before surrendering to the mud and muck of daily life. Over time, the line between bed and floor blurred, everything blending into a single muddied tapestry of survival. And let's not forget the unwelcome guests, fleas, lice, and all manner of itchy companions. Waking up scratching was as much a part of the morning routine as breaking the ice on the water bucket. If you managed more sleep than scratching, you were ahead of the curve. But in all seriousness, these makeshift beds, crunchy, buggy, and ever so fragrant, were literal lifesavers. Straw and rushes insulated against the cold, and sleeping close together became medieval central heating. Next time you settle into your plush mattress, spare a thought for the peasant lying on a straw pile, grinning with satisfaction at not having frozen solid. Somewhere in the cosmos there's a medieval villager looking down at your memory foam, missing teeth and all, mouthing, "Must be nice." All of this, of course, took place inside a home that was itself waging war against the winter. Medieval peasant houses were feats of stubborn optimism, wattle and daub walls, sagging thatch roofs, and enough cracks to make Swiss cheese jealous. The cold didn't just sneak in, it barged through the door, sometimes literally. So how did peasants fight back? With whatever they could find. Moss, straw, rags, bundles of grass, even tufts of animal hair. Anything vaguely squishy and insulating was jammed into cracks and crevices. Each winter brought a fresh round of patching, stuffing, and hopeful muttering. Some enterprising souls smeared extra mud and dung on their walls, layering it thick in the hope of fending off drafts. Picture standing outside, caking your own house with manure and thinking, this is fine, this is high living. Roofs were another sore spot. Thatch was cheap, but far from watertight. Snow and rain found their way in with alarming regularity. The solution? Plug the leaks with whatever's handy. Scraps of cloth, bundles of reeds, or when desperation strikes, a chunk of turf from your neighbour's field. Over time, every cottage became a patchwork monument to improvisation and chilly perseverance. Doors and windows, if present, were little more than planks and wishes. Windows were often just holes covered with animal hides, or thick cloth, sometimes soaked in animal fat for extra wind resistance and a lingering scent of mystery meat. If you were lucky, these barriers would keep out the worst of the drafts, though the cold always seemed to find new entry points. Each night was a showdown, you versus the cold, armed with a patchwork fortress and a strong sense of denial. Sometimes you won, sometimes the cold delivered a frosty slap that left you questioning your life choices. But through stubbornness, ingenuity, and the endless search for anything even remotely insulating, peasants managed to muddle through the bitterest winters. So the next time you're tempted to complain about your heating bill, just remember, a medieval peasant would have considered your drafty apartment the height of luxury. In their world, every handful of dirt, every patch of straw, and every greasy cloak was another line of defense in the endless siege of winter. And as you adjust your thermostat, perhaps spare a moment of gratitude for the lumpy laundry bags, the earth-connected sleepers, and the pioneers of tactical filth. Against all odds, and a truly vindictive winter, they endured, one muddy handful at a time. But of course, surviving the cold wasn't just about what you wore or where you slept. When the cold bites hard enough to keep you awake at night, medieval peasants had a solution. Let's take a look at the nighttime routines and personal strategies that kept them, sometimes barely, on the warm side of survival. When the winter wind starts howling like it's auditioning for a part in a horror movie, and the cold gnaws at your bones, medieval peasants didn't just shiver and hope for the best. No, they had a method. Not exactly military precision, more like inspired desperation of getting through the night alive. Forget everyone drifting peacefully off at once. Instead, they invented the medieval equivalent of a graveyard shift, sleep rotations. This wasn't a well-oiled operation, mind you. There were no bugles, no rosters, and definitely no one with a clipboard. It was more like a family-sized relay race of exhaustion. Half the household stayed up, lurking about the fire, patching drafts with whatever rags or straw they could find, while the other half squeezed together under a patchwork of thin blankets and hay, chasing after a few fitful hours of not quite frozen sleep. Now the fire was the diva of this whole operation. If left alone, it would sulk into cold embers faster than you could say frostbite. And relighting it? Picture convincing a donkey to do ballet. Possible, but not without sweat and tears. So someone was always on ember watch. And since nobody wanted to trade their toasty corner for a cold one, families rotated the duty grudgingly. One moment you're half dreaming about a sunbeam, the next you're being nudged by a sibling, and suddenly you're squat by the hearth, poking at stubborn coals and muttering curses that would make even the family goat blush if goats were capable of shame. Let's talk about luxury. There were no midnight snacks, no snooze buttons, and certainly no plush slippers, just aching joints, drooping eyelids, and a growing sense of injustice toward whoever managed to snore through the chaos. Children who could wield a stick were already on the rota, learning early that in winter, you either helped out or you became a medieval popsicle. Grandparents, with their wisdom and joints that creaked louder than the door hinges, sometimes sat by the fire longer, not always out of choice, but because getting up and down was essentially a full-body workout. The result, a household in perpetual motion, half asleep, half awake, and 100% motivated by the primal fear of freezing solid. When it was finally your turn to sleep, good luck. Between people shuffling around, the wind rattling the walls, livestock making their own special contributions to the ambience, and the occasional sharp elbow from a sibling who mistook your ribs for free real estate, rest was a luxury. If you managed to drift off, you did so to the soundtrack of snoring, goat grumbling, and the gentle, ever-present threat of hypothermia. But somehow, this system, chaotic as it was, worked. There was always someone awake to keep the hearth glowing, and as long as the embers endured, so did the people. The cost was a collective sleep debt that would make a modern college student weep, but at least no one woke up as a human icicle. So next time you grumble about nudging the thermostat in the middle of the night, or sigh dramatically when the cat wakes you at 2 a.m., spare a thought for your medieval counterpart, blinking blearily into a smoky fire at 3 in the morning, wondering if they really needed all their toes. Because in those huts you knew it was cold when even breathing required strategy. Yes, you heard that right. Breathing itself became a survival tactic. Deep, open-mouthed gulps of air brought the cold straight into your lungs, and in an era where pneumonia was less an inconvenience and more a death sentence, that was a mistake you only made once. Peasants perfected what I like to call survival breathing. Instead of panting like you've just run from a pack of wolves, they breathed shallow and slow, always through the nose. This gentle method warmed the air a bit before it hit their lungs, which wasn't exactly tropical, but it was better than hacking yourself into the grave by Candlemas. Accidentally gasp in a lungful of icy air. Congratulations, you just earned yourself a week of medieval wellness treatments, hot onion tea, fervent prayers, and a stern lecture from Grandma. Some even went so far as to wrap a corner of their cloak or a rag across their face at night in a DIY attempt at a heat exchange mask. The result? You woke with a damp, slightly sour patch clinging to your lips. But hey, it beat freezing from the inside out. Parents drilled these habits into their kids early on. If little Edith started mouth breathing, she'd get a scolding sharp enough to warm her cheeks. Medieval childhood, equal parts itchy wool, breathing exercises, and the joy of sharing a straw mattress with an aggressively aromatic goat. Picture this: the family, bundled in cloaks and scratchy shawls, nestles down on straw bedding, sandwiched between livestock and hope. Breathing becomes a kind of grim winter yoga. Inhale softly, exhale through the nose, move as little as possible, and above all, don't let the cold catch you unawares. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. One shallow breath at a time, peasants survived the kind of nights that would have modern folks pricing flights to the tropics. But breathing wasn't their only trick. In the endless chess match with winter, peasants discovered another secret weapon, the full belly defense. Turns out, one of the best ways to fight off the chill wasn't another layer of questionable wool, but a hearty meal before bed. Calories, in the medieval mind, equaled warmth. The more your innards had to churn, the more heat you built up. Call it medieval thermodynamics, with the digestive tract as your very own furnace. So, what did this late-night feast look like? Heavy, brown, and unashamedly practical. Thick stews loaded with turnips, onions, and parsnips. Grains like oat porridge or barley gruel. Dense rye bread, and if Lady Luck smiled, maybe a scrap of salted pork or dried sausage. There were no Instagram-worthy meals here. The goal? Eat something that would sit in your gut like a friendly brick, radiating warmth as it slowly digested. Michelin stars? More like survival stars. It wasn't just a matter of stuffing in as much as possible. The trick was to choose foods that took longer to break down. Fatty meals were especially prized, not just for the energy, but because fat burns slow and steady, keeping you warmer for longer. After a meal like that, you'd feel ready to face the night, even if it also meant a night of vivid cabbage-fueled dreams. Parenting was straightforward. Eat your turnips or face the icy consequences. Children who complained about vegetables quickly learned the cold was a much less forgiving critic. Of course, there were side effects. Yes, you might be a degree or two warmer, but you also risked tossing and turning as your digestive system tried to make sense of half a vegetable patch eaten in one sitting. Still, the gamble was always worth it, because in the end, peasants weren't after culinary perfection, they were after survival. If that meant bedding down bloated and breathing shallowly next to a steaming cow, well, so be it. Now, let's talk about medieval bedtime technology. Forget electric blankets and heated mattress pads. The peasant's arsenal was pure ingenuity. The haybox and the legendary heated stone. The haybox sounds like something you'd find at an overpriced rustic spa, but the concept was simple genius. Take a wooden box, line it with hay, and use it to keep cooked food warm for hours without burning more precious fuel. That leftover stew, toss it in the haybox, and you'd have a warm bite ready, even after the fire had given up for the night. a medieval slow cooker, humble but effective. But why stop at food? Peasants realized that if hay could keep a stew hot, it could do the same for a nice hefty rock. Enter the era of the heated stone. Before bedtime, someone, usually the child with the worst luck or shortest straw, would select a flat stone and let it roast in the heart of the fire. When it was nearly too hot to touch but not quite a medieval branding iron, it was pulled out and carefully wrapped in rags, then tucked under the hay mattress or at the foot of the bed. Presto, a medieval heating pad, ready to fend off frostbite. Of course, this system had its risks. Wrap the stone poorly, and you might wake to the smell of smouldering bedding. Drop it on your foot, and you'd be explaining your limp to the neighbours for weeks. But when it worked, it was nothing short of miraculous. A little island of warmth in a sea of cold. Luxury, in this world, was defined as not waking up with icicles forming on your eyebrows. In the grand arsenal of peasant winter survival, a hot rock in a hay mattress might not sound like much, but when you're clinging to every scrap of warmth, it's practically a spa day. The result: one more night survived, one more dawn greeted, and another chapter in the never-ending saga of human stubbornness in the face of adversity. So, next time you find yourself grumbling about your apartment's faulty radiator or the inconvenience of resetting the thermostat, remember the medieval peasant elbow-deep in embers at midnight, wrapped in every rag they own, inventing survival tricks that would make even the hardiest outdoorsman blink. They didn't have the luxury of complaining. They had ingenuity, grit, and an unshakable will to see another sunrise. And as the embers smouldered through yet another frigid night, the spirit of resilience burned just as fiercely. But for the medieval peasant, survival wasn't just a solo act. The fire, the warmth, the very heart of winter endurance, it all depended on something bigger than one person's ingenuity. Which brings us to our next chapter: the hearth, the community, and the remarkable power of collective survival. In a medieval peasant's home, the hearth wasn't just where you cook dinner. Step into a medieval peasant's hut on a frost-bitten January night, and you'll find the hearth isn't just a cooking accessory. It's the throbbing, smoky heart of the household. In fact, if you were to draw up a family tree, I'm convinced the hearth would be listed right between Uncle Edric, who owes us chickens, and that one goat who keeps eating our shoes. It's loud, temperamental, prone to coughing out clouds of soot, and the only thing standing between you and a starring role is a medieval popsicle. Every evening, as darkness thickens outside and the wind recites its bone-chilling monologue through the thatch, the family's nightly ritual begins. Sleeping arrangements are less about comfort and more about playing an elaborate game of don't freeze to death before sunrise. The fire's warmth is doled out like a precious inheritance. The youngest, oldest, and sickest are planted closest to the flames, prime spots reserved for those least likely to survive an accidental night as a human icicle. Babies, those tiny heat engines with the survival instincts of a potato, are nestled right up to the hearth, swaddled and watched over by elders whose stories and sharp elbows are equally legendary. Older children and sturdy adults spread out strategically from this warm nucleus, forming concentric circles of body heat insulation. If you're a robust farmhand, congratulations, you've just been promoted to outer layer of the human lasagna. It's not just charity at work, it's practical calculus. Keep the family's future and memory bearers alive, and with any luck, you'll all make it to spring. But let's not get too sentimental. There's a reason no one in medieval Europe wrote poetry about sleeping by the fire. Drift too close and you might wake up with your hair singed, or your blanket sporting a suspiciously crispy patch. Too far, and you'll spend the night shivering so violently that your teeth will sound like a medieval percussion section. The fire, for its part, is a moody overlord. It radiates a narrow cone of heat, roasting the lucky few directly before it, while everyone else scrambles to catch a fleeting slice of warmth like lizards fighting for a single sunbeam. If you manage to fall asleep facing the fire, you might enjoy one blissfully toasty cheek, while the other side of your body slowly auditions for the role of statue in a snowstorm. And just when you think you've claimed your place in this thermal dance, the family dog muscles in, pushing its way between you and the flames, tail wagging dangerously close to disaster. Chickens, apparently immune to dignity, perch on hearthstones, clucking softly into the smoky gloom as if appointed official guardians of the warmth. Every crackle from the logs, every hiss of escaping sap, is a gentle reminder you're still alive, you're still warm, at least for now. Sleep, when it comes, is a fragile truce. Peasants drift into uneasy dreams, lulled by the fire's pops and the chorus of soft snores, while their breath ghosts into the chill beyond the fragile circle of heat. It's not comfort, it's not luxury, but it's life, clinging to existence by the thread of a glowing coal. And here's the thing, in medieval Europe, winter survival was never a solo sport. Unless you fancied yourself as a particular decorative frozen statue, you needed the village as much as you needed the fire. Survival was a glorious, muddy group project, messy, noisy, and absolutely essential. The whole village, every stubborn, gossiping, turnip-hoarding soul, became an extended, if occasionally dysfunctional family. The peasants understood that even the strongest fire and the deepest hay pile could only do so much. If the familiar smoke from a neighbour's chimney stopped its morning spiral, someone noticed. If old Tom, notorious for both his debts and his stories, failed to appear at market, a quiet alarm rippled through the community. And while yes, perhaps some of that concern was motivated by the memory of a borrowed chicken or a missing cooking pot, the deeper truth was simple. In the dead of winter, your neighbour's survival was directly tethered to your own. Enter the winter watchers, the unofficial patrols of medieval life. These were the ones too young or too old for field work, but sharp-eyed enough to monitor the subtle rhythms of village life. They'd spot who was hacking up a lung, whose windows stayed dark too long, or which house looked suspiciously still amid the frost. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of a neighbourhood watch, only with more sheep and fewer neon vests. If a family's fire guttered out, it was a crisis. No one wanted to discover a neighbour frozen solid come spring thaw, so rescue came in the form of a glowing coal bundled in rags, or, if things were truly dire, an invitation into an already overcrowded hut. Picture it, 4 extra bodies shoehorned onto straw pallets, the air thick with smoke, wet wool, and a palpable sense of communal stubbornness. It wasn't comfort, it was a survival strategy forged by necessity and a grudging affection for your fellow villagers. Food stores, grim as they were, also became communal lifelines. During especially brutal winters, villagers would pool the last salted slivers of pork, the dregs of grain, the shriveled turnips and dried beans. It was charity with a hard edge. No one had much to spare, but a single communal meal might spell the difference between springtime celebration and a silent, empty hut. Even the smallest children understood the gravity. They delivered firewood, ferried embers, and sprinted across frozen lanes with urgent messages. In winter, there was no such thing as too young or too tired. Everyone was enrolled in the grand, desperate campaign against the cold. Of course, let's not pretend medieval villages were idyllic circles of mutual admiration. Feuds over goats, property lines, or who snuck an extra ladle of stew were perennial favourites. But as the nights grew longer and colder, grudges were quietly parked beside the fire. Today's irritating neighbour might be tomorrow's saviour, dragging you from a collapsed roof or sharing the last stubborn hunk of bread. In the icy heart of winter, the village transformed into a single, sprawling, mud-splattered household, often dysfunctional, frequently hilarious, always united by one shared mission: outlast the season. One muddy boot, one borrowed ember, one grimly determined laugh at a time. But warmth and wit could only carry you so far. When the wind shrieked through the walls like a banshee with a grudge, medieval peasants turned to prayer. Faith wasn't reserved for Sundays. It was woven into every smoky, shivering night. Before crawling under layers of scratchy wool and straw, families would kneel by the fire, sending up hurried prayers for warmth, health, and the continued structural integrity of their roof. Saints became household names, pressed into duty as winter's bodyguards. Saint Blaise was invoked to shield against sore throats, a matter of life and death when a single cough could spiral into disaster. Saint Nicholas, long before his reinvention as the jolly gift-giver, was petitioned to protect homes from ruin and hunger. Faith was a practical tool as much as a spiritual comfort. Superstition and ritual snuggled up close to the practicalities of survival. Some families flicked holy water around the hearth, hoping to ward off evil spirits, or, at the very least, mischievous drafts. Others marked their doorways with blessed chalk after certain feast days, inviting good fortune and warmth to step inside. Vigil candles, sometimes blessed by the local priest or the most devout old woman, the one who swore she could smell a blizzard coming, flickered through the night as silent pleas for mercy. And of course there were bargains whispered into the smoke. "Lord, if you'll just get us through to morning, I swear I'll stop cursing at the neighbour's geese." Faith, in winter, was less about piety and more about desperate negotiation, a running conversation with the heavens conducted in frostbitten breaths and cracked hopeful voices. Yet for all the ingenuity, prayers and communal grit, winter sometimes had the final word. Some years the cold pressed in so hard that no hearth could stand against it. Take the infamous winter of 1315. Relentless rains drowned crops, livestock withered, and cold gnawed the marrow from every bone. Stories from those dark months tell of villagers boiling shoe leather for soup, scraping bark from trees, and whispered only in the blackest nights, resorting to unthinkable acts when true starvation set in. When the fire died and food ran out, families clung together for warmth one last time. Come spring, neighbours sometimes found entire households frozen in a final embrace, as if determined to share a few more heartbeats before surrendering to the season. Even the houses themselves fell victim to winter's cruelty. A heavy load of snow could collapse a roof in the dead of night, trapping those inside. And if you thought trudging through waist-deep snow to beg shelter from an equally desperate neighbour was a guarantee of rescue, think again. Resources were stretched as thin as a monk's patience at a village fair. Cold and hunger bred disease. Starvation weakened bodies until even a minor cough became a death sentence. Homes thick with smoke and bodies became breeding grounds for pneumonia and bronchitis. A sore throat in December could mean a funeral by January. And then there was frostbite, the silent thief. Fingers, toes, even noses succumbed to the cold, blackening and dying, a grisly badge of honor for those who survived, a permanent reminder that winter always took its due. Yet perhaps the most chilling reality wasn't just the loss, but the acceptance of it. Death was never a stranger in medieval winter. It was an expected guest, wrapped in frost, waiting its turn by the door. Villagers pressed on anyway, grieving, stubborn, clinging to life with a tenacity that would put modern complaints about drafty windows or high heating bills in sharp perspective. As long as a single ember glowed in the hearth, as long as one breath lingered in the icy air, the fight continued. And here's where the story twists. Just when you've settled into a haze of soot, suffering, and stubbornness, it's easy to look back and see only the hardship, the cracked hands, the chill-blamed feet, the huts that smelled like a goat who lost a bet. But look closer, and you'll spot something else. A legacy of breathtaking ingenuity and unyielding endurance. No one had central heating, plush blankets, or the luxury of taking tomorrow for granted. What they did have was an unbreakable code of adaptation. Every hay-stuffed mattress, every moss-chinked wall, every carefully banked fire, these were solutions born of necessity and relentless creativity. Their communities weren't just geographical accidents, they were webs of trust, obligation, and shared survival. They learned to watch over the vulnerable, to pool resources when food ran low, to understand that today's act of kindness might be tomorrow's lifeline. They lived by the unspoken law, no one beats winter alone. Faith, too, became a kind of endurance, prayers woven into the very fabric of daily survival. Not just pleas for deliverance, but stubborn hopes whispered through cracked lips that after 100 nights of darkness, spring would come and life would push through the thawing earth once again. And somehow it did, because of their unglamorous victories, surviving one more storm, sharing one more ember, future generations thrived. Bit by frozen bit, the medieval peasantry pushed humanity forward, enduring winters their ancestors could barely imagine, until warmth became the expectation instead of a fever dream. Their sweat, ingenuity, and resilience are stitched invisibly into the lives we enjoy today. Every cozy blanket, every lazy winter evening, every cup of tea sipped in a snug house, all are the legacy of those who refused to bow to the cold. So next time the wind howls against your window and you grumble about the thermostat, spare a moment for the nameless, fearless souls who turned shivering survival into a living legacy. One ember, one breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. And as winter's grip loosens and we step out of the smoky gloom of the peasant's hearth, our time-traveling fixer eyeing the muddy path ahead, the scene shifts. We leave behind communal fires and the persistent ache of cold, and enter a world where survival isn't just about warmth and bread, but about ambition, politics, and the razor's edge of royal favor. Because, as it turns out, sometimes history's greatest upheavals begin far from the hearth. Anne Boleyn didn't come into the world with a crown on her head, or armies at her feet, but as we'll soon see, one young woman's rise would set the entire kingdom ablaze. Let's set the scene. Early 1500 England, a kingdom where the word glamorous usually meant you got to keep most of your teeth. Into this world, Anne Boleyn arrives, not with a regal trumpet or a celestial spotlight, but with the quiet, unspectacular birthright of a minor noble's daughter. Born around 1501, perhaps at Blickling Hall or Hever Castle, take your pick, the historians are still fighting over it. Anne was the second daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an up-and-coming diplomat, and Elizabeth Howard, who could trace her lineage to some of the highest-born families in England. If you're picturing a gilded nursery and the gentle hush of noble women sipping tea, think again. Anne's early years were closer to the Tudor starter pack, drafty rooms, the persistent aroma of damp rushes, and enough family ambition to fill a dozen castles. Yet, even in this landscape of modest privilege, Anne Boleyn was already quietly rewriting her own script. History tends to ignore the children who don't seem destined for greatness, but Anne's story was an exercise in subtle defiance. She was clever, sharper than a tailor's needle, and twice as quick to pick up on the shifting winds of favour. Those who met her noted not her fortune, nor her beauty, which, by the standards of the day, was more striking than storybook, but the glint in her dark eyes and the whip-smart cadence of her conversation. Anne was, in a word, magnetic, a rare trait for a young woman in a world that preferred its daughters quiet and its ladies obedient. Sensing her potential, her parents did what any ambitious family in Tudor England would do. They sent her packing. First, Anne landed in the dazzling court of Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, a world away from the muddy English countryside. Imagine trading in your rain-soaked cloak for a front-row seat at the epicenter of European diplomacy. Here, Anne learned to read a room faster than most could read a book. She watched, she listened, she absorbed the subtle art of making yourself essential while appearing invisible. Her time abroad would shape her like a blacksmith at the forge, hammering out the raw iron of her character into something formidable. But if the Netherlands sharpened Anne's edges, France was where she truly began to shine. For years, Anne moved among the elegant circles of Queen Claude and Marguerite of Navarre. While other English ladies were perfecting their needlework, Anne was perfecting her French and, more importantly, the art of conversation. She learnt to navigate intrigue with the grace of a dancer and kept her wit sharper than the silver on the dinner tables. She witnessed queens who ruled from behind embroidered fans, wielding power with a glance or a word. It was a masterclass in influence, and Anne was a star pupil. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, Anne was no longer the simple country girl. She was cosmopolitan, self-assured, and though she would never be called traditionally beautiful, utterly captivating. Her eyes sparkled with intelligence. Her voice, quick and musical, seemed to carry secrets. She moved with a confidence that suggested she was always slightly ahead of everyone else, as if she knew where the story was going and was quietly amused by it. She wasn't the type to enter a room. She was the type to change its gravity. Where others wilted under scrutiny, Anne thrived. And if you think the English court was ready for this particular thunderstorm, think again. Henry VIII's court was a place of calculated smiles, elaborate etiquette, and a very strict hierarchy, especially for women. Most ladies of the court were bred to be gentle, pale, and polite, the Tudor equivalent of background wallpaper. Then in swept Anne, with her bold eyes and sharper tongue, dressed in the latest continental fashions and exuding a confidence that seemed, to some, downright scandalous. She became a maid of honour to Queen Catherine of Aragon, a position that was both an honour and a test. Anne's French manners, her dancing, her laughter that rang through the halls, it all set tongues wagging. Men turned their heads, women whispered. The court, always hungry for novelty, found itself drawn to the new arrival. But Anne didn't just attract attention, she orchestrated it. She seemed to understand, instinctively, the power of being both seen and slightly out of reach. She was a puzzle people wanted to solve, a storm they couldn't predict. And in this world of hidden alliances and invisible daggers, that was a dangerous kind of power. And then, the king noticed her. Henry VIII, at this point, was the golden boy of Europe, tall, athletic, and crucially, accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. His court was a playground of flirtations, secret trysts, and the occasional scandal. But Anne didn't play by the usual rules. She didn't faint at his compliments or giggle at his jokes. She bantered, she teased, and most shocking of all, she refused him. Henry, who had grown used to instant adoration, found himself captivated by the chase. Anne was a puzzle, and Henry, ever the collector of trophies, became determined to win her. Letters began to pass between them, filled with longing and frustration. Henry offered Anne the position of royal mistress, a role with more unofficial power than most duchesses could dream of. Anne, in a move that would have sent most of her peers into a fainting spell, said no, she would not be another name in the king's ledger. If Henry wanted her, he'd have to make her his queen. It was an audacious gambit, the kind that could make or break a family's fortunes. After all, there was the inconvenient matter of Henry already having a wife, Queen Catherine of Aragon. Catherine was beloved by the people, fiercely dignified, and perhaps most importantly, protected by her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. The very idea of replacing her was political dynamite. Anne, however, was undeterred. She'd seen the delicate power games of Europe's finest courts. She knew that ambition was a dangerous game, and that the only safe place to stand was at the centre of the storm. She walked the candlelit halls of the English court with purpose, cultivating allies, deflecting rivals, and keeping her true intentions veiled behind a mask of playful wit. She wasn't just playing to be admired, she was playing to win. As the months passed, Anne's relationship with Henry moved from flirtation to obsession. Henry wasn't just smitten, he was besotted, and in his desperation, he began to contemplate the unthinkable, divorcing Catherine. Divorce in England at the time was more than a personal scandal. It was a religious and political earthquake. Catherine, after all, had been married to Henry's older brother Arthur before his death. The Pope himself had granted permission for her to marry Henry. Now, Henry insisted their union was cursed, that God had withheld a male heir as punishment. Never mind that this theory was, shall we say, flexible with the facts. Henry needed an excuse, and Anne needed a crown. Anne played her part with surgical precision. She offered just enough encouragement to keep Henry hopeful, but never enough to make herself seem eager. Every word, every glance was calculated. She wasn't just aiming for marriage, she was positioning herself to become the next Queen of England. The court exploded into factions. Some nobles, ever the opportunists, courted Anne's favour, seeing the winds of change blowing in her direction. Others clung to Catherine, loyal to the old order, and horrified by the prospect of Anne on the throne. Diplomats scribbled frantic letters to Rome. Foreign monarchs issued veiled threats. Henry's own advisers shifted nervously, sensing the ground shifting beneath their feet. The king's obsession with Anne was no longer just a matter of the heart. It was a full-blown political and religious crisis. For 7 long years, the kingdom held its breath as Henry bombarded the Pope with petitions, cajoled his lawyers into finding loopholes, and slowly realized that the church would not bend. Catherine refused to go quietly, bolstered by her formidable family connections. And yet Anne remained cool, always just out of reach, her ambitions undimmed. The stakes could not have been higher. Henry's frustration mounted. The court became a hothouse of intrigue, as loyalists and opportunists jockeyed for position. Anne wasn't just the king's infatuation, she was the lightning rod for a kingdom's future. The question was no longer whether she would become queen, but what England would look like if she did. Finally, after nearly a decade of manoeuvring, scandal, and diplomatic chaos, Anne's gamble paid off. In January 1533, she and Henry were married in secret. It was the sort of move that, in most circles, would have earned you a polite invitation to leave the party. In Henry's world, it was a declaration of war against tradition, against Rome, and in many ways against his own past. By June, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The spectacle was undeniable, but the mood was tense. Londoners peered from their windows, some cheering, others muttering prayers for Catherine. The air was thick with uncertainty. Was Anne a blessing, or a herald of disaster? Anne ascended not as a beloved figure, but as a storm front rolling in from the continent, bold, dazzling, and unpredictable. Where Catherine had embodied the virtues of humility and piety, Anne was all sharp edges and dazzling wit. She wore vibrant colours, wielded her influence like a rapier, and made enemies at a pace that would make a porcupine look sociable. Her position, for all its trappings of security, was anything but safe. Everything depended on her ability to produce a male heir, a fact Anne understood with chilling clarity. Early in her pregnancy, Anne and Henry were jubilant, certain that their union would finally yield the longed-for son. But when Anne gave birth in September 1533, the child was a girl, Elizabeth. Anne, to her credit, masked her disappointment with poise, insisting that the next child would surely be a boy. Henry, ever the optimist when it suited him, began to brood. The adoration in his eyes flickered, replaced by the cold light of doubt. Still, for a moment Anne's influence was unrivaled. She transformed the court, elevating her family and introducing a new style, part French sophistication, part English audacity. Foreign ambassadors jostled for her attention. Old alliances crumbled and new ones formed in her shadow. Most dramatically, Henry moved to sever ties with Rome, establishing himself as head of the Church of England, an act that shook Europe to its core, all so that Anne's crown could not be questioned. And yet, even at the zenith of her power, Anne stood on a precipice. Old friends whispered behind their hands, enemies circled, waiting for the first sign of weakness. Henry, restless and ever hungry for novelty, began to look elsewhere. Anne had won the crown, but the cost and the risks were incalculable. It's a twist worthy of any modern drama. The woman who had upended a kingdom, who had bent the king's will and the church's authority, now found herself in a position as perilous as it was powerful. Anne Boleyn's story was no longer just about ambition or love. It had become a high-wire act, with the eyes of the world watching and the consequences of a single misstep too terrible to contemplate. And so, as we leave Anne standing in the echoing halls of power, her crown still gleaming but the shadows gathering, our tale is only half told. The next chapter will show us just how high and how precariously she climbed. After all, Anne Boleyn had reached heights almost unimaginable for a woman of her time. But as every time traveller knows, the higher you soar in history, the longer and more dangerous the fall. Next, we'll watch as Anne Boleyn, having climbed higher than almost any woman of her time, faces the dazzling heights and dizzying dangers of Henry VIII's court, a world where loyalty is fleeting, enemies are everywhere, and the price of power can be deadly. If you ever find yourself transported back to the Tudor court, as I do with alarming frequency, armed only with my wits, a discreet notepad, and a bottomless reserve of sarcasm, let me offer a word to the wise: never outshine the king. Anne Boleyn, however, did just that, and like Icarus soaring too close to the sun, she discovered that courtly favour is as fickle as English weather. Sunshine one moment, thunderbolts the next. Anne's ascent was nothing short of audacious. She was not born with a crown, but with a razor-sharp mind and a will steely enough to make the Tower gates jealous. When she entered Henry VIII's orbit, she didn't merely walk, she danced, she dazzled, she defied every expectation. The king, accustomed to docile beauty and silent agreement, was captivated by her wit, her intellect, and her refusal to simply become another ornament in his collection of wives. Anne was a storm in a velvet gown, and for a while Henry loved nothing more than weathering that storm. But the court is a place where ambition is currency, and every smile hides a calculation. From the moment Anne's slender fingers brushed the gold and pearls of the coronation crown, the clock began ticking. The whispers started before the applause faded. Could she give Henry what he craved most, a legitimate male heir? The weight of the Tudor dynasty, the hopes of a restless king, the future of England itself, all pressed down on Anne's shoulders. No pressure, right? It's only the fate of the realm. When Elizabeth was born, red-cheeked, lively, and unfortunately for Anne, very much a girl, the bells of London rang, but the sound was hollow. Henry's pride flickered, his smile forced. Anne's triumph trembled on the edge of disappointment. She had delivered a healthy child, but not the son Henry saw in his dreams, or as I sometimes suspect, in his vanity mirror. Anne did not give up. She threw herself into the exhausting and perilous business of royal procreation. Pregnancy after pregnancy followed, each one shadowed by hope and the gnawing anxiety of what would happen if she failed. The court watched her every move, their eyes hungry for any sign of weakness. A miscarriage here, a stillbirth there. Each loss was not just a personal tragedy, but a public spectacle. Anne, already feeling the chill of a drafty Tudor palace, colder than a medieval popsicle, now felt the chill of Henry's disappointment creeping in. Henry, that most singular of monarchs, grew distant. The king, who had once serenaded Anne with poetry and promises, now filled the air with sighs and silence. Their quarrels became legendary. Anne's sharp tongue, once his favourite spice, grew bitter to his taste. She demanded love, loyalty, respect, the very things that had won her the crown. But Henry, ever the connoisseur of novelty, began to seek comfort elsewhere. Obedience was the new currency, and Anne's account was running low. Outside the royal bedchamber, the wolves began to circle. The court, which had tolerated Anne's rise with the forced cheer of someone watching a neighbour's obnoxiously loud party, now openly rooted for her downfall. Catherine of Aragon's supporters, still seething at Anne's usurpation, sharpened their knives with every rumour that drifted through the palace. Among the common folk, Anne was blamed for everything, from the schism with Rome to the price of fish, and then, with the subtlety of a cold draught through a thatched cottage, Jane Seymour entered the scene. Where Anne was fire and brilliance, Jane was soft candlelight, quiet, demure, and most importantly biddable. Henry's gaze, always restless, found in Jane the balm for his bruised ego. Anne noticed immediately. She redoubled her efforts, lavishing Henry with affection, promising sons, pleading for patience. But the king's heart, once set ablaze by Anne's defiance, now longed for the gentle compliance Jane so expertly performed. Court politics, never a game for the faint of heart, turned deadly. Thomas Cromwell, that master puppeteer of Tudor intrigue, once Anne's strongest ally in the English Reformation, now saw her as an obstacle. Their alliance had always been transactional. Cromwell wanted order, Anne wanted reform. But as Anne championed the poor and challenged the privileges of the nobility, Cromwell saw his own position threatened. He began, quietly at first, to plot her removal. The back rooms of the palace, always thick with the scent of tallow and treachery, churned with whispers. Cromwell collected rumours, nurtured grievances, and set traps. Witnesses were rounded up, confessions extracted in ways that would make even the staunchest medieval peasant blanch. The charges were outlandish: adultery, incest, conspiracy. Anne, the dazzling queen, was now cast as England's greatest villainess, her every courtly smile twisted into evidence of seduction and betrayal. In the gilded halls, Anne's few remaining friends watched in horror as the machinery of destruction spun to life. George Boleyn, Anne's brother, was swept up in the dragnet. Men who had once enjoyed her patronage now found themselves accused alongside her. The evidence was as thin as the gruel they serve in medieval dungeons: dates that didn't match, encounters that never happened, testimonies bought and paid for with the promise of survival. Anne fought back with all the brilliance that had defined her rise. In private, she pleaded with Henry, reminding him of their passion, of the promises they'd made. She tried, through wit and sheer force of will, to reclaim her place. In public, she stood her ground, refusing to confess to crimes she did not commit. But the court, always hungry for spectacle, demanded a fall as dramatic as Anne's ascent. On May 2nd, 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. I watched from the shadows as she rode past, her face set in a mask of dignity and defiance, the murmurs of the crowd rising like a bitter wind. The gates slammed shut behind her, sealing off not just the Queen, but the woman who had dared to rewrite the rules of the game. Inside the tower, Anne was not cowed. She prayed, she reasoned, she prepared. Her ladies, those few who had not abandoned her, wept in shadowy corners. Anne, ever the comforter, told them not to fear. She even joked, her humour sharp as always, that soon she'd be remembered as a queen who had literally lost her head. It's the kind of gallows humour that's only funny when you know the executioner is on speed dial. Henry, meanwhile, had already moved on. As Anne awaited her fate, Henry's court buzzed with preparations for his next marriage. Jane Seymour lingered just beyond the reach of scandal, waiting to step into Anne's shoes, hopefully with her head still attached. For Anne, this was the deepest cut. The man who had defied the Pope, upended an entire kingdom, and courted her with the persistence of a medieval spam email, now refused even to look her in the eye. The trial was a masterclass in Tudor theatre, equal parts tragedy and farce. Anne stood before a tribunal of nobles, many of whom owed their fortunes to her rise. Now, they sat in cold judgment, prepared to erase her from the tapestry of history. The charges: adultery with multiple men, incest with her own brother, high treason would have been laughable if not so lethal. But this was not a quest for truth. It was a performance, a justification for what the king had already decided. Anne's defence was fierce. She denied every accusation with the same fire that had once won Henry's heart. She reminded the court she had been crowned with sacred oil, chosen by God, and anointed as Queen of England. She spoke of loyalty, sacrifice and love, but it was all for nothing. The verdict had been written long before Anne entered the hall. The witnesses, many coerced or bribed, delivered their lines. Evidence was contradictory, sometimes outright impossible, but reality in Henry's court was whatever the king wished it to be. Anne was found guilty, Her brother George and the other accused men received their own death sentences. For Anne, the punishment was beheading, a small mercy, in an era when traitors were typically dispatched in ways best left undescribed during dinner. When the sentence was read, Anne did not break. She stood, pale but proud, and declared that she was ready to meet her fate, praying God would have mercy. As the doors closed behind her, the court exhaled. The storm that was Anne, brilliant, dangerous, unforgettable, was nearly spent, but in their haste to erase her, they were cementing her legend. Anne, condemned and betrayed, was about to become more powerful in memory than she had ever been in life. Locked once more within the tower's cold embrace, Anne faced the end with a courage that left even her jailers in awe. She spent her final hours in prayer, her voice steady, her hands clasped tightly, her faith unbroken. She confessed to no crimes, insisted she was innocent, and prayed her death would bring peace to England and mercy for her daughter Elizabeth. Her ladies, loyal to the last, wept for her. Anne, ever the comforter, soothed them with bitter humour. "I shall be a queen who loses her head," she quipped, a spark of the old Anne flickering in the darkness. Even at the end, she refused to let her captors or history define her spirit. Henry, meanwhile, busied himself with the arrangements for his next wedding, even as Anne's execution date was set. The speed of his transition from grieving husband to eager bridegroom was, to put it mildly, record-breaking. It was as if he were simply changing the linens on his royal bed, one queen out, another in, all in a day's work. On May 18, 1536, Anne learned that she would die the next morning. She spent the night in prayer, asking forgiveness, not just for her own faults, but for those who had wronged her. She prayed for her enemies, for her daughter, and for the country she had tried to serve. There was no drama, no wailing, just a quiet dignity that belied the chaos swirling outside the tower walls. In a final act of what passed for royal mercy, Henry arranged for a French swordsman to carry out the execution, a swifter, cleaner death than the axe. Whether this was for Anne's comfort or Henry's conscience is anyone's guess. Anne accepted her fate, preparing herself with the same composure she had shown in life. Dawn broke over the tower, the mist curling around the ancient stones. Anne, dressed in a dark grey damask gown, trimmed with fur, a crimson kirtle beneath a queen's wardrobe for her final act. She pinned up her dark hair, tucking it beneath a simple cap. There would be no dramatic displays, no pleas for mercy, only a final walk into history's judgment. And as the city beyond the tower walls waited, uncertain and anxious, Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, survivor, fighter, stepped forward. Her end was near, but her legend was just beginning. If there's a lesson here for us time-travelling fixers, and perhaps for anyone navigating the perilous world of power, it's this. In a world ruled by whispers and shifting alliances, resilience isn't just survival. Sometimes it's immortality. And so, as the tower bells tolled and Anne prepared to meet her fate, the shadow of her story stretched out across England and beyond. But this is not the end. In fact, Anne's final moment will echo far louder than any coronation bell. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the scaffold built within the Tower of London's walls. May 19, 1536. Rain threatens, but the Tower of London is shrouded in the kind of chill that seeps right through your bones and makes you wish just for a moment that medieval England had discovered central heating. I'm here, squeezing into the crowd, blending in as just another courtier with a nose for drama and a very questionable hat. The scaffold looms in the tower's inner ward, a rough wooden platform rising above the uneasy spectators. Courtiers huddle together, wrapped in their finest cloaks, though no amount of velvet can block out the tension or the cold. Even the ravens seem to have gone silent. Anne Boleyn emerges, her grey gown fluttering in the breeze, a colour choice that frankly wouldn't have made the Tudor best-dressed list, but it suits the moment. She looks impossibly thin, shadows under her eyes, but her spine is straight. There are no tears, no frantic pleas, just the quiet dignity of a woman who once toppled a kingdom and now faces its wrath. A hush falls, so deep you could hear a mouse sneeze. She speaks, her voice clear and unwavering. No accusations, no last-minute courtroom drama. Anne prays for the king's health. Yes, the very man who orchestrated her downfall. Imagine wishing your ex a long and happy life just moments before your own is about to end. That's poise. That's the kind of grace you don't find at most modern breakups. The crowd, hungry for spectacle, finds itself disarmed. Even the guards shift uneasily. perhaps wondering if they're witnessing more than just an execution, perhaps the end of an era. The French executioner steps forward, his blade gleaming in the morning light. He's been brought in for his reputation, quick, efficient, and less likely to turn a royal beheading into a grisly spectacle. Anne kneels upright, hands clasped in prayer, her gaze lifted skyward. A soft white cloth is tied around her eyes, shutting out the world but not the chill. The executioner whispers for his assistant to fetch his sword, a practiced distraction. The blade flashes once, swift and silent. In a heartbeat, Anne Boleyn, Queen, Mother, Thunderclap in human form, is gone. Her body is hurried to an unmarked grave within the tower's walls, laid in an arrow chest because naturally no one remembered to order a proper coffin. This is medieval England, where even queens sometimes end up with bargain basement burials. A woman once crowned in gold is consigned to the earth with hardly a whisper. But as I step back from the freshly turned soil, it's clear that Anne's story doesn't end here. In a twist worthy of any time-travelling fixer's favourite reruns, her legacy is only beginning. Her daughter Elizabeth, the child whose birth once disappointed a king so much he nearly invented the world's worst gender reveal party, will one day reshape England. Elizabeth's reign will become legendary, the Virgin Queen, patron of the arts, nemesis of the Spanish Armada, and the sharpest mind in any room. She inherits her mother's fierce spirit and her unbreakable will. Anne's bloodline, once a political liability, becomes the foundation of a golden age. Anne Boleyn didn't just rattle the royal marriage bed. She helped trigger the rupture with Rome and the rise of the Church of England. Her ambition redrew the map of faith and power. Her fall, meanwhile, sent a message that even queens could be discarded like yesterday's news, or at least yesterday's questionable fashion. Yet in the end, it's Anne's legacy, not her crown, that blazes through history. Her life and death echo in every portrait of Elizabeth, in every line of Shakespeare, in every English ship that sails the world. Immortality won not by survival, but by seismic impact. Jump cut, because history loves a good pattern interrupt. And suddenly, we're over 2 centuries later, across a stormy Atlantic, in the simmering cauldron of the American colonies. It's the early 1770s, and I've swapped my ruffled Tudor sleeves for something less flammable. If England of Anne's day was a chessboard, the colonies are now a game of Jenga. One bad move and the whole thing's coming down. The relationship with Britain has soured like forgotten milk. Colonial patience, once stretched thin, has snapped. It didn't start with tea, of course. Years earlier, the Stamp Act had already made colonists pay for everything from newspapers to playing cards, provoking groans from every would-be card shark in Boston to Philadelphia. Then came the Townshend Acts, taxing everyday essentials, paper, glass, paint. Parliament, 3,000 miles away, keeps tossing new laws into the fire, like a chef who's never tasted his own cooking. At first, the response is almost polite. Petitions, pamphlets, the kind of fiery op-eds that would make modern social media jealous. Colonial assemblies issue formal protests, merchants organise boycotts, and writers like Samuel Adams and John Dickinson fill the papers with passionate arguments about liberty and rights. But as months tick by, politeness curdles into frustration, frustration hardens into anger, and anger, well, it needs a vent. The trouble isn't the money. The taxes themselves are pocket change compared to what the average Londoner pays. But it's about principle, being taxed without a say, treated like unruly children rather than grown partners in empire. It's the colonial version of being grounded for something your cousin did, with no chance to plead your case. Boston becomes the epicenter of resistance. The Sons of Liberty, a shadowy squad of patriots who'd fit right in at any modern protest, grow louder and bolder. Tensions explode in 1770 with the Boston Massacre, when British soldiers open fire on unarmed civilians, leaving blood on the cobblestones and trust in ruins. After that, reconciliation is as likely as a polite Twitter debate. By 1773, the colonies are balancing on a knife's edge. One final spark will set the whole thing ablaze. That spark isn't a musket ball or a royal decree. It's something far subtler. Crates of tea stacked and waiting in the holds of British ships. Parliament, in a stroke of genius or perhaps sleep deprivation, passes the Tea Act. The idea is simple. Let the struggling British East India Company sell tea directly to the colonies, skipping the middlemen, making tea cheaper than ever. On paper, it's a win-win. In reality, it's about as wise as offering discounted matches in a fireworks factory. The Tea Act leaves the hated tax in place, meaning that buying the tea equals accepting Parliament's right to tax the colonies without representation. For Americans, this is unthinkable, a betrayal of every principle they've fought for. The news spreads like wildfire. Merchants see their businesses threatened by a monopoly that could crush local trade. Patriots read between the lines. The Crown still thinks it can do whatever it pleases. In Boston, already nursing old wounds from the massacre and years of hardship, the Tea Act is recognized instantly as a trap. To accept the tea is to surrender. To refuse is to stand for liberty. Meetings swell with angry colonists. Newspaper columns sizzle with rhetoric, hot enough to curl your powdered wig. The Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams and his merry band of rebels, organize boycotts and vow that no East India Company tea will touch American soil, or more importantly, American teapots. Across the colonies, tea ships are turned away from harbors. From New York to Charleston, the cry is the same: we will not be bought, not even for a discount. But Boston's fate is uniquely stubborn. 3 ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver, arrive and anchor in the harbor, refusing to budge. Royal officials demand the cargo be unloaded and the tax paid. Colonists dig in their heels. It's a staring contest and nobody's blinking. The tension is so thick you could slice it with a lobster fork. The city becomes a powder keg. Every day without resolution turns the screw tighter. Taverns buzz with rumor. Churches echo with fiery sermons. Public squares become arenas for debate. The Sons of Liberty move swiftly, posting public notices, holding raucous gatherings, and whipping up a storm of resistance. The Old South Meeting House becomes the nerve center. Thousands cram inside, breath fogging the air, voices rising in unison. Each resolution, each speech, each vote against the unloading of tea is another hammer blow to British authority. But time is running out. British law demands that imported goods like tea be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days. If the ships stay, customs officials will seize the cargo and collect the tax by force. The Sons of Liberty know that once the tax is paid, even under protest, the principle is lost. It's not just about tea anymore. It's about whether the colonies will accept being treated as subjects without rights, or whether they'll fight for a future of their own making. Meanwhile, Governor Thomas Hutchinson, arguably the world's least flexible man, refuses to let the ships leave without unloading their cargo. The law is the law, he insists, and colonial outrage be damned. Backing down would mean admitting that mobs, not monarchs, rule the colonies. Boston's standoff becomes the talk of the town and the world. Everyone knows something is about to break. You can feel it in the air, that sharp, metallic taste before a thunderstorm, the kind of anticipation that makes even the most stoic Bostonians grip their tankards a little tighter. Somewhere in those crowded streets, a decision is quietly taking shape, a plan that will echo across oceans and centuries. And as I mill through the throngs, eavesdropping in my best 18th century disguise, it's clear the city is bracing for a storm. All it will take is one spark to ignite an explosion. And so, as we leave the echo of Anne Boleyn's Final Dawn and the restless tea-crazed streets of colonial Boston, history stands on the cusp of transformation. Next we'll plunge into the night when that spark finally flies, the Boston Tea Party itself. December 16th, 1773, dawned grey and cold over Boston, a city balanced on the edge of history. December 16th, 1773, Boston wakes to a sky the colour of pewter and a wind that bites through even the thickest colonial cloak. The city hums with anticipation, its cobbled streets slick with frost, its citizens wired as taut as bowstrings. For nearly 3 weeks, 3 British tea ships have been anchored in the harbour, a trio of floating powder kegs. The Dartmouth, the Eleanor, the Beaver, names that will soon echo far beyond this narrow, shivering port. Each ship represents the King's law, each crate of tea a test of colonial resolve. This morning the final deadline looms, a bureaucratic guillotine set by Parliament. By British rule, the tea must be brought ashore, the tax paid, within 20 days of arrival. Any hesitation, and customs officials have authority to seize the cargo, call in the redcoats, and enforce imperial order at gunpoint. Everyone in Boston knows these rules by heart. Everyone knows what's at stake. If even a single chest touches Boston soil with the tax paid, the colonists' stand on liberty dissolves like sugar in hot water. The principle, their claim to rights, to self-determination, will have been surrendered, one soggy tea crate at a time. By mid-morning, the Old South Meeting House pulses with life. It's the largest building in town. but today it's bursting at the seams. Thousands of Bostonians and country folk jam shoulder to shoulder, their breath turning the air thick and damp. Some have trekked miles through sleet and slush, boots caked in mud, just to be here for this moment. The overflow crowds spill onto the streets, straining to catch even a muffled word from inside. It's the colonial version of waiting outside a sold-out concert, only with more frostbite and slightly less screaming. The air thrums with tension, with the nervous fidgeting of men and women who know history is brewing just outside. At the center stands Samuel Adams, his voice as steely and unwavering as ever. He presides over the chaos with the gravitas of a man who spent years picking fights with empires. One by one, speakers rise to denounce the Tea Act, denouncing taxation without representation, the tyranny of a distant king, the gall of being forced to pay for the privilege of drinking overpriced British leaves. Their words echo through the rafters, met with cheers, jeers, and the occasional well-placed heckle. But for all the fiery rhetoric, a heavy uncertainty lingers above the crowd. Outside, the city seems to hold its breath. What can be done, the people wonder, without turning a protest into open war? How far are they willing to go before the king's soldiers descend? As the hours grind on, the tension ratchets up. Riders thunder in from the outskirts, boots pounding, bearing bad tidings. Governor Thomas Hutchinson, his wig no doubt bristling with indignation, refuses to budge. The ships will not leave until the tea is unloaded. The tax will be paid. The king's law will prevail, so says Hutchinson, so says the Crown. The rumour ricochets through the crowd, fueling outrage and dread in equal measure. Inside, the walls of the meeting house seem to vibrate with the force of so many voices. But Samuel Adams, ever the master of the moment, brings the room to a hush. He utters a sentence that's both a full stop and a starting gun. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. The meaning is unmistakable. No more debates, no more petitions. The time for talk has ended. The next act will not be spoken, it will be done. Suddenly, from somewhere outside in the gathering dusk, a war whoop splits the air, a jarring, wild sound, part signal, part challenge, like the world's most dramatic ringtone. The effect is electric. The meeting scatters into action, men surging into the streets, faces set, eyes blazing. There's no confusion, no chaos. The plan is already in motion. In the shadows, men begin to transform themselves. They smear soot on their faces, wrap themselves in rough blankets, an crude approximation of Mohawk warriors. But let's be honest, nobody's mistaking these Bostonians for actual Mohawks. The disguise isn't about deception, it's about metamorphosis, about shedding old identities and declaring themselves something new, something untamable. It's a costume party with revolutionary stakes, each man becoming both anonymous and iconic in a single smoky gesture. It wasn't about fooling anyone, it was about creating a symbol, a message no one could mistake. Twilight settles over Boston, painting long shadows across the wharves. Figures move silently, purposefully through the chill. These are not professional revolutionaries. They're carpenters, blacksmiths, apprentices, fishermen, ordinary men with calloused hands and threadbare coats, now cloaked in the trappings of rebellion. They converge on Griffin's Wharf, where the tea ships bob in the icy water, their hulls groaning with the weight of their infamous cargo. The air is thick with the briny tang of the harbour, the sharp note of winter, and underneath it all, the tense electric silence of anticipation. There is no shouting, no drunken bravado. This is not a riot, not the chaotic brawl the British fear. It is a mission, executed with calm, ruthless efficiency. Hatchets glint in the lantern light. Clubs are gripped tight. In a flurry of movement, the disguised colonists swarm the decks, overwhelming the few sailors on board. There is no violence, no harm to the crew. The sailors are nudged aside, left to gape as silent witnesses to the unfolding spectacle. With a series of well-practiced blows, the colonists hack open the wooden tea chests. The aroma of fresh tea, earthy, astringent, oddly comforting, spills into the night, mingling with the scent of wet rope and salt. Chest after chest is hoisted and hurled overboard. The crates hit the water with heavy splashes, shattering the quiet, sending up geysers of icy spray. 342 chests in all, each one a small rebellion, a thumbed nose at the world's mightiest empire. The black waters of Boston Harbour churn and swirl, flecked with soggy tea leaves, a giant bitter brew steeping under the moon. Along the waterfront, silent spectators gather, men, women, children, some clutching shawls tight against the cold, others just hungry for a glimpse of history in the making. British guards stand at the edges, frozen, watching. Whether they're paralysed by confusion, secret sympathy, or the simple fear of being the first to escalate, no one can say. For tonight, at least, the redcoats are bystanders. The discipline of the protest is astonishing. No one pockets a trinket. No one breaks into the cargo holds for rum or sugar. Only the tea is targeted, nothing else. Even as hunger gnaws at Boston's paw, even as temptation beckons from every crate, the men stick to the plan. It's a strange kind of restraint. All principle and no profit. In a world where most protests devolve into free-for-alls, this is more like a choreographed ballet of defiance, if ballet involved axes and very soggy tea. When the last chest disappears into the black water, the harbour is transformed. It looks like a monstrous teapot overturned, a swirling cauldron of splintered wood and drenched leaves. The smell is everywhere, smoky, sharp, with a hint of bitterness. It clings to hair, to coats, to every inch of Boston. The deed is done. With barely a word, the men slip away, vanishing into the labyrinthine streets. They leave no names, no signatures, only the echo of their defiance and the unmistakable mark of revolution. As the final crates bob and sink, Boston stands utterly still, as if the city itself is holding its breath, waiting for the consequences to thunder down. This was not a riot, not a drunken escapade, not the chaos the British authorities had braced for. This was something colder, sharper, a calculated, deliberate act of rebellion, carried out under the cover of night. The harbour is now a giant, swirling teapot, its surface stained black by thousands of pounds of East India Company tea. Some colonists, unable to resist, scoop up handfuls of the soaked leaves, only to be sternly rebuked by the Sons of Liberty patrolling the docks. Nothing is to be salvaged, no one is to profit. This was principle pure, bitter, and uncompromising. Morning breaks over Boston, and the city awakens to the lingering aroma of salty tea, the air heavy with the scent of defiance. News travels at the speed of gossip, faster than any horse. By midday, from the bustling markets to the draftiest attics, everyone knows Boston has thrown down the gauntlet. Reactions split like a cracked chest of tea. Among the patriots there's a fierce, swelling pride, a sense that ordinary men have just landed a blow against the world's most powerful empire. Among loyalists and moderates the mood is one of horror and dread. They whisper, has Boston gone too far? Have the colonies crossed a line that can never be uncrossed? In his mansion, Governor Hutchinson fumes, his anger echoing off the gilded walls. It's not just the loss of the tea, though. The financial blow is severe, but the message sent, if the king can be defied so openly here, what's to stop the flames of rebellion from leaping to every colony? British officials are thunderstruck. They expected protests, maybe a riot or two. They did not expect a disciplined, coordinated group to calmly destroy a king's fortune and then disappear without so much as a broken window. The ship captains of the Dartmouth, the Eleanor and the Beaver, can only watch as their precious cargo sinks beneath the waves. In the ledgers, the loss is tallied at over £10,000, a staggering sum, but the true loss can't be measured in pounds or ruined crates. It's the loss of trust, of loyalty, of the illusion that Britain's rule is accepted with anything resembling consent. That night, as tea slips beneath the harbour's surface, something else rises, a shared, undeniable truth. The age of petitions and polite protest is over. A reckoning is coming, and Boston is ready. Across the Atlantic, the news arrives in London like a slap to the face. British officials are livid. To them, the Boston Tea Party isn't just vandalism, it's open rebellion, a public mockery of royal authority, and it cannot be ignored. King George III, hearing the details, reportedly grows cold with fury. Parliament, already weary of colonial insubordination, erupts in outrage. Retaliation is swift and merciless. The first blow falls as the Boston Port Act. In a single crushing decree, Parliament orders the closure of Boston's harbour, the city's beating economic heart, until the cost of the destroyed tea is repaid and order restored. Trade evaporates overnight. Ships vanish from the docks. Goods and essential supplies dry up. Boston, once rowdy and raucous, falls eerily silent. The docks, usually buzzing with life, are now haunted by the ghost of prosperity. But the punishment doesn't stop there. The Massachusetts Government Act strips the colony of self-government, placing it under the direct rule of the king's appointed officials. The Administration of Justice Act declares that royal officers accused of crimes will be tried back in Britain, a free pass for any redcoat with a penchant for trouble. And to drive the point home, British soldiers are quartered throughout Boston, living among the very people they are meant to cow. The message is blunt: rebellion will be crushed. Liberty is a luxury the king will no longer tolerate. Yet, in a twist worthy of a colonial soap opera, Parliament's heavy hand backfires. Instead of cowering in submission, the other colonies bristle with outrage. News of Boston's suffering travels fast. Letters, broadsheets, whispers in taverns and churches. Wagon loads of food and supplies roll into the city from near and far. Words of support, secret pledges, clandestine meetings. These weave the scattered colonies into something new, a nascent nation. What began as Boston's crisis becomes America's cause. In punishing Boston, the Crown hoped to make an example. Instead, Boston becomes a beacon, a rallying cry for resistance. The embers of revolution, once faint and isolated, now flare to life across the continent. There will be no easy way back, no gentle extinguishing of this fire. And so, as Boston's harbour stews in its bitter tea, the city stands not as a cautionary tale, but as a symbol, a city punished for its principles, and a nation awakening to its collective power. The world will soon learn. You can close a harbour, but you can't dam a revolution. And as the scent of rebellion drifts inland and the colonies tighten their ranks, we find ourselves looking beyond Boston's barricaded port to distant lands and ancient secrets. Because, as it turns out, the shockwaves of the Tea Party travelled much farther than anyone in Parliament could have guessed. The punishment of Boston sent shockwaves far beyond the rocky shores of Massachusetts. You know, it's one thing to toss chests of tea into a frigid harbour, and quite another to realise that by sunrise you've managed to pull 13 squabbling colonies into actual agreement. When Parliament slammed the doors on Boston quite literally with locks, chains, and the kind of British indignation usually reserved for misbehaving spaniels, it didn't just punish a city. It triggered a seismic ripple that rattled the teacups all the way from Georgia's humid rice fields to the frosty hills of New Hampshire. As your ever-dedicated time-travelling historical fixer, currently dodging both redcoat patrols and the world's most passive-aggressive Puritan landlords, I watched the outrage morph into something the British never saw coming: unity. For decades, the colonies had acted like a dysfunctional family at Thanksgiving. Virginia eyed Massachusetts with suspicion. Pennsylvania felt superior to everyone. South Carolina just wanted to be left alone with its indigo. But when word spread that Boston's harbour was shut tight and Massachusetts stripped of its own governance, a new awareness swept the land. If Parliament could do this to Boston, nowhere was safe. Today it's Boston's tea. Tomorrow it's your molasses. The response was as swift as a midnight horse ride. Wagon trains creaked north with barrels of salted pork, flour sacks and heartening letters. Town meetings rang with fiery speeches, and the kind of communal outrage usually reserved for surprise taxes on cider. Newspaper presses clattered through the night, their ink-stained operators fueled by righteous indignation and probably a little pilfered rum. The suffering of Boston wasn't just Boston's problem anymore. Somehow, in the smoke and echoes of the Tea Party, everyone realized we're in this together. And so, in the sticky heat of September 1774, something unprecedented happened. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, a city that even then seemed to smell faintly of bread and compromise. For the first time, 12 of the 13 colonies sent representatives to huddle under a single roof, the air thick with nerves, pipe smoke, and the unspoken question, what now? There stood George Washington, still more land surveyor than legend, Patrick Henry, whose voice could peel the wax off a candle, John Adams, already rehearsing speeches in his head, Samuel Adams, wishing for stronger ale. Officially, they weren't demanding independence. Not yet. Most clung to the hope of reconciliation, of patching things up with the mother country and going back to the old days of mutual respect and the occasional polite tax protest. But beneath the layers of formality and carefully worded petitions, something deeper was stirring, the realization that the colonies could no longer afford to stand apart. Inside that Congress, the delegates agreed to a sweeping boycott of British goods, a proto-Black Friday, minus the stampedes. More importantly, they pledged to support each other against further British aggression. It was a pact, whispered in taverns and thundered at town meetings. An attack on one would be an attack on all. In candlelit rooms across the continent, words once spoken only in hushed tones grew bold. Unity, resistance, liberty. Britain had hoped to terrify the colonies into submission. Instead, It had welded them into something far more dangerous. Americans with a purpose. The winds of revolution, which had once rustled quietly through the trees, now gathered into a full-blown tempest. Britain, for all its power, found itself chasing shadows, trying to grasp loyalty as it slipped through its fingers. The night the tea disappeared beneath the icy surface of Boston Harbor, it wasn't just the East India Company's profits that drowned. The illusion that colonists would always be loyal subjects, content with crumbs from the imperial table, vanished too. In the months following the Tea Party, that spark became a wildfire. Where once there had been scattered boycotts and polite protests, now there was open resistance, town militias drilled in clearings, muskets gleaming, storehouses filled with powder and shot. Men who had toasted King George III in warm, smoky taverns now whispered about revolution in those same corners, the air thick with possibility and fear. Boston, battered and blockaded, became a symbol, a martyr city, unbowed beneath the weight of imperial punishment. Every silent ship that sailed past Boston's closed harbor was a floating reminder. Tyranny had met its match in colonial stubbornness. Parliament had meant the intolerable acts as a warning, a cautionary tale written in suffering. But the message backfired. From Georgia's swampy banks to New Hampshire's granite hills, people began to see their fates as intertwined. This was no longer about tea. This was about survival, identity, and the right to decide your own future. By the spring of 1775, the tension snapped in the green fields outside Boston. In Lexington and Concord, British troops marched out to seize colonial weapons, only to find themselves confronted by farmers, ordinary men in homespun clothes, standing shoulder to shoulder, ready to trade plows for muskets. The first shots of the revolution echoed through the morning mist, a direct consequence of that cold night when men had chosen principle over profit and emptied the harbor of its tea. The Boston Tea Party proved to the world that revolution doesn't always arrive with fanfares and banners. Sometimes it begins with a handful of shivering conspirators, their faces smeared with ash, choosing defiance over comfort. They weren't just tossing tea, they were tossing out their old identities, subjects of a distant king, and forging something new and dangerous, revolutionaries. And as for Britain, well, it had just created its own worst nightmare. The American colonies were awake, united, and ready for whatever came next. But while Boston was transforming from rebellious outpost to revolutionary icon, the world beyond the Atlantic and the passage of time held its own secrets. Shift with me for a moment. The scent of brine and gunpowder fades. The clamour of colonial protest gives way to a silence so ancient it hums beneath the skin. Picture a land before the pyramids of Giza, before Babylon's ziggurats or Stonehenge's silent stones. Long before any of these monuments caught the sun, in the parched valleys of coastal Peru, something astonishing was taking shape. For centuries, the valley of the Supe River seemed little more than a wasteland, a place where only rocks, dust, and the occasional stubborn cactus dared linger. To the passing traveller, and let's be honest, even to your jaded historical fixer, it looked about as promising as a medieval peasant's winter stew, thin, grey, and unlikely to inspire poetry. But, as history likes to remind us, appearances deceive. Beneath the sun-baked crust, nearly 5,000 years ago, the city of Carroll quietly rose. Not a scattering of huts or a few hopeful bean patches, but a sprawling metropolis planned, organised, and built on a scale that would have made even the most ambitious Egyptian architect pause mid-stone drag. Carroll boasted pyramids, plazas, residential quarters, ceremonial spaces. It was a marvel pulsing with vision and communal energy centuries before the Egyptians ever started stacking limestone blocks. Here's the kicker. Carroll's people did all this without the wheel, without metal tools, and without writing. Their blueprints weren't etched onto tablets, they were sketched in memory and passed hand, calloused hand. They built with nothing but stone, earth, and the alchemy of human will. Forget Wi-Fi, running water, or even a halfway comfortable bed. Carroll's citizens survived and thrived on ingenuity, cooperation, and the ability to make the desert itself yield to their designs. And yet, for millennia, Carroll's story lay buried. Even when explorers and locals stumbled across its weathered mounds, they dismissed them as natural formations, just more lumps in an unforgiving landscape. No one imagined that under the sand and silence slept one of the oldest cities on Earth, predating the so-called cradles of civilization by centuries. It took the persistence of archaeologists like Ruth Shady, digging under the relentless Peruvian sun in the late 20th century, to uncover the truth. Their shovels and brushes coaxed from the earth not just walls and bones, but a revolution in our understanding of civilization. Carol had been the mother city of the Americas, a place of complexity, peace, and innovation. Its people had built a world in a land where everything, even hope, seemed impossible. When I first arrived, masquerading as a very sunburned, suspiciously unskilled laborer, I was floored by the audacity of it all. Here, in a place where the wind howls and the river is little more than a shimmering thread, humanity had carved out a thriving society. They saw not a desert, but a canvas. They mastered the river's floods with ingenious irrigation, coaxing green life from the unforgiving soil. Cotton became their gold, spun into nets for fishing, woven into trade goods, binding them to coastal communities and distant strangers alike. But Carol was more than crops and commerce. Its architects understood survival was about balance. They built homes and plazas to withstand both the blistering sun and the rare, punishing storms. They tracked the stars, planned harvests, and built a network of trade that funneled exotic shells from the Pacific and rare stones from the Andes into their oasis. For centuries, Carol's stones kept their secrets. Now, as archaeologists unearth its plazas and pyramids, those stones speak again, whispering stories of resilience, of a people who made community their shield and ingenuity their greatest resource. They didn't conquer the land with force. They partnered with it, learning its rhythm and transforming adversity into opportunity. So, as Boston's revolutionaries stood defiant atop their ruined tea chests, forging a new sense of American identity, the stones of Carol, half a world and 4 millennia away, remind us that the drive to survive, adapt, and unite is as old as civilization itself. 2 stories, separated by centuries and geography, joined by the unbreakable thread of human resilience. And now, as the wind rises over the desert and the ancient pyramids of Carol cast their long shadows, we're just beginning to uncover the full wonder of this forgotten city. Because rising out of the desert like ancient guardians, the pyramids of Carol defy everything we thought we knew about early civilization in the Americas. Let me take you for a moment to a place where the desert meets the sky, a place so old that even the sand seems to pause, listening for echoes of a civilization almost forgotten. Carol. Here, rising from the parched earth like silent sentinels, stand the pyramids of Carol, monuments so massive and deliberate, they turn every assumption about early American societies on its sun-baked head. Now, if your mind immediately leaps to lopsided mounds of mud or wonky, hastily stacked stones, you're in for a surprise. These pyramids weren't the wobbly first drafts of people just learning how to build. No, these were architectural masterpieces, deliberate, imposing, and frankly, the kind of thing that would make any ancient Egyptian architect do a double take and mutter, how did they pull that off without a single camel or a bronze chisel? At the heart of this sprawling city was the grandest of them all, the Pyramid Mayor. Picture it, spanning more than 450 feet in length, stretching across the desert like the world's most committed sandcastle, and rising nearly 60 feet above the valley floor. That's about the height of a 6-story modern building, if you're keeping score at home. Not too shabby for a civilization with no metal tools, no wheel, and not a single workhorse in sight. Instead, the builders of Carol wielded stones, mud, and cleverness. Their secret weapon, woven reed bags. Yes, bags, stuffed with rocks, carted across the sand by hand. An ancient version of the reusable grocery tote, but with considerably more bicep required. The engineering wasn't just impressive for its scale, it was ingenious. The desert here isn't just dry, it's temperamental. Earthquakes occasionally rumble through, rearranging the landscape like a child upending a box of blocks. Yet the pyramids of Carol were built to last, flexing and yielding just enough to survive the centuries. The Pyramid Mayor, battered by wind, sun, and the occasional tectonic tantrum, has stood its ground for nearly 5 millennia. It's the architectural equivalent of your grandma's cast-iron skillet, battered, seasoned, and somehow indestructible. But here's where Carol really throws a curveball. These pyramids weren't tombs. There are no pharaohs, no cursed sarcophagi, no labyrinths filled with booby traps and hieroglyphs warning trespassers of eternal doom. Instead, Carol's pyramids were the beating heart of communal life. They crowned the city as temples and gathering places, their summits reached by broad staircases that beckoned the people upward. Fires once blazed atop these platforms, rituals unfolded beneath the open canvas of the Andean sky. Imagine a city where the most important buildings aren't reserved for the dead, but for the living. for music, celebration, and the kind of meetings that must have made even the most introverted priest sigh and wish for a quiet corner. At the feet of these pyramids, vast plazas opened up, some sunken and circular like ancient amphitheaters carved into the ground. Here, thousands could assemble for ceremonies, communal feasts, or perhaps the world's earliest version of a town hall meeting minus the PowerPoint presentations and budget debates. The city's layout radiated a sense of order and community. Caral was a place where the architecture itself insisted on connection, on drawing people together under the stars. Around these ceremonial hubs stretched residential blocks, homes for priests, artisans, farmers and administrators, forming a living tapestry that fanned out from the pyramids. But it wasn't just earthly planning at work. The pyramids were aligned with celestial events, tracking sunrises, solstices, and the steady march of the stars. Here, architecture was not merely functional, it was mathematical, spiritual, a literal bridge between earth and sky. The people of Caral built with an eye toward eternity, their city a cosmic diagram etched into the desert itself. Wandering among the ancient stones today, I couldn't help but feel a strange awe. The sheer precision of it all, achieved without a single metal blade or rolling wheel, without ox or donkey or even a particularly sturdy llama, just calloused hands, mathematics, and a stubborn refusal to let the desert win. The pyramids of Caral weren't built for glory or vanity or the spoils of war. They were built to connect, to link the dust of the earth to the endless sweep of the heavens, to bind a community together, and to whisper across the sands, "We were here." And what a story those stones still tell. Unlike so many ancient sites, Caral offers up a profound difference. Look closely, no weapons buried beneath its dust. No defensive walls circling its plazas, no mass graves or signs of conquest, no murals glorifying the thunder of battle or the gods of war. Instead, Caral seems to have been a civilization founded on peace, a revelation really, when you consider how many ancient cities spent most of their history trying not to be burned down. It's almost as if Caral didn't get the memo that early civilizations were supposed to be violent, expansionist and obsessed with fortifications. Here, the energy usually spent on armies and armor went instead into architecture, astronomy, music and trade. The city's plazas and pyramids were not war trophies, but stages for celebration, worship, and self-governance. This was a society that chose to gather instead of conquer, to negotiate instead of destroy. It's a pattern interrupt in the great bloody narrative of ancient history, a gentle reminder that there's another way to build a legacy. Trade fueled Caral's success. Along the fertile riverbanks, cotton fields flourished, and the fibers were spun into fishing nets, essential for barter with coastal communities. In exchange, Caral received dried fish, the ancient equivalent of a protein bar, and exotic treasures from far-off places. Shells plucked from the Pacific, shimmering stones from the highlands, even rare fruits carried across mountain passes. This intricate web of exchange stitched together distant peoples, binding the region into a peaceful network of mutual benefit. At the center, Caral thrived, a cultural and economic hub shimmering in the desert sun. Religion and ceremony played their roles, not as divisive forces but as glue for social harmony. The city's grand plazas, their geometry so precise it would make any high school math teacher weep with joy, became theaters for rituals, forging unity through shared belief. And music. Oh, the music! Caral rang with the haunting melodies of flutes carved from condor and pelican bones, the deep pulse of drums stretched with deer hide. These weren't the clumsy creations of bored children, but carefully crafted instruments, tuned to carry song across the plazas and into the night. In a world without written language, music became the voice of the soul. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the dusk settling over Caral, the last light glinting off stone. Drums begin to thrum in the plaza, their rhythm pulsing through the sand. Flutes rise, keening like the wind racing down the valley, as hundreds of feet stamp in time, sending up clouds of dust beneath the ceremonial fires. Priests, draped in intricate woven cloaks, chant to the gods of river and sky. In these moments, Caral was not a city of stone, but a living symphony, a harmony of community, cosmos and spirit. The very design of the city reinforced this ritual life. The sunken circular plazas acted as ancient amphitheaters, focusing sound and sight onto the ceremonies at their center. Above, the pyramids loomed, not as tombs but as sacred mountains, hand-built to reach for the heavens. Rituals marked the turning of seasons, the cycles of planting and harvest, the wandering of stars. Music was more than background noise. It was the bridge that spanned earth and the divine, joining the mundane to the mysterious. And here's another twist. No terrifying murals of gods demanding blood. No evidence of mass human sacrifice. In Carol, the spiritual world appears painted in softer hues. A society of harmony, reverence and celebration, not terror. Even now, if you let the desert wind whistle through the ruins, you might almost hear those ancient melodies, the faint echo of a flute, the distant beat of a drum, the chorus of voices rising in unity. Corral's forgotten songs speak of a people who found beauty, meaning and survival amid the relentless sand. Corral wasn't just a center of music, trade and ritual. It was an engineering marvel, a testament to human resilience and ingenuity in one of Earth's harshest landscapes. Without metal, wheel or draft animal, the people of Corral shaped a city of stone that has defied the centuries. Their pyramids rose from the valley floor, not with fragile bricks but with massive stones lugged across the desert by hand-woven reed bags, the ancient equivalent of a CrossFit gym, but with better scenery. Every stone placed was a lesson in adaptation. The region is notorious for earthquakes, yet Carol's monuments have endured. The secret? Flexible construction, wide foundations, layered fills, and rounded corners that allowed the buildings to absorb and dissipate the fury of the earth. It's the kind of earthquake resistance that modern engineers still study, then stare at their own blueprints and sigh. Water, always scarce, was managed with the precision of a master chef measuring out the last pinch of salt. The people of Corral built irrigation channels and canals, carefully guiding river water to their fields. Not a drop was wasted. Even during seasons when the desert seemed determined to bake everything to a crisp, crops flourished, testament to a society that wrung survival from the reluctant land. And the city itself, urban planning par excellence. Major buildings aligned with celestial points, sunken plazas doubling as astronomical instruments, letting priests track the cycles of sun and stars, vital for harvest and ritual. The city was a living calendar, a stone symphony, echoing the rhythms of the cosmos. Residential quarters, administrative zones, ceremonial centers, all arranged with a harmony that speaks of complex organization and shared vision. They didn't just build for themselves, they built for the generations yet to come, crafting monuments that would outlast memory. Today, as modern engineers and archaeologists walk Carol's dusty avenues, they marvel at the wisdom encoded in those ancient stones, proof that greatness is not always a matter of technology, but of understanding, adaptation, and the quiet genius of working with nature, not against it. So Carol's pyramids remain silent, sunlit, humming with the ghosts of music and laughter. They are not monuments to conquest, but to collaboration. They are not echoes of war, but of community. They are not relics of domination, but testaments to the enduring spirit of people who found a way to flourish in a world that offered them little but dust, wind, and the unblinking stars. And as twilight settles on those weathered stones, you can almost feel it, the lingering heartbeat of a civilization that chose peace, ingenuity, and celebration over the sword. Carol's legacy is written not just in stone, but in the very air, in the spaces between echoes, in the possibility of a different, gentler path. But what became of this desert symphony? How did Carol's harmony fade into silence, and what secrets lay buried, awaiting rediscovery centuries later? For that, we must turn the page and follow the city's story into its mysterious twilight. For centuries, the city of Carol flourished, a beacon of peace, music, trade, and architectural mastery in the desert sands. Ah, Carol. If you squint just right at the sun-bleached sands of the Supe Valley, it almost looks like any other stretch of Peruvian desert. Undulating hills, the occasional stubborn shrub, and wind that whispers secrets only to those patient enough, or perhaps foolish enough to listen. But beneath those dusty mounds lies the story of a city that rose, flickered with brilliance, and then slipped quietly into silence. And yes, as your friendly neighborhood time-traveling historical fixer, I can confirm, not a single dramatic fire, no toppled statues, not even an errant chariot wheel left behind. Carol's end. It was less Game of Thrones, more a gentle Irish goodbye. Picture Carol in its heyday, a city humming with life, the air shimmering with the sound of reed flutes and the rhythm of drums, markets bustling with barter, cotton for fish, gourds for precious salt. Pyramids and plazas stretch out in geometric harmony, the kind of urban planning that would make even modern city councils weep with envy. There's no hint of chaos or looming doom, just the regular pulse of a civilization at peace with itself and its environment. The sun sets, casting long shadows over sunken amphitheatres, and for a moment you might think this city would last forever, and then silence. Not the crash of conquest or the moan of disaster, just an absence. The plazas clear out. The laughter of children fades. The music, the flutes, the drums, the gentle thrum of daily life goes quiet, as if someone set down their instrument and simply forgot to pick it up again. No burnt layers, no battered gates, no hastily abandoned treasures to suggest a crisis. Carol just faded, slipping beneath the sands like a dream at dawn. But why did they leave? That question hangs in the air like the last plaintive note of a song. Even now, as I pace the deserted avenues in scandalously sand-filled shoes, thank you very much, the mystery lingers, scratching at the back of my mind. Was it the climate? Some scholars say yes, that a long, punishing drought throttled the lifeblood from Carral's fields. The river, once generous, may have withdrawn its favour, leaving parched cotton and shriveled gourds where green once thrived. Without surplus food and fibre, the web of trade that Carral spun so brilliantly could have unravelled, strand by strand. Others point to shifting trade routes, always the bane of a city's existence, then as now. As coastal neighbours rose and inland valleys beckoned, Carral's goods, its cotton, its dried fish, its produce, might simply have lost their lustre. Imagine the city's merchants looking up one day to realise the world had moved on, their stalls a little emptier each week. Slowly, the economic heart of Carral could have faltered, not with a bang, but with the slow exhale of unmet expectations. And then there's the spectre of internal decline. No records survive to tell us of power struggles, religious schisms, or the exhaustion that sets in after centuries spent carving pyramids out of desert stone. Yet even the most harmonious societies can fray under pressure, especially when the future turns uncertain. Perhaps as the environment changed and trade dried up, the delicate balance of Carral's community began to wobble. Maybe a quiet malaise set in, the slow, unremarkable migration of families seeking greener valleys, stronger rivers, a place where their children might once again sleep without the nightly risk of turning into desert popsicles. Whatever the cause, Carral's departure was not sudden. There's no evidence of mass flight, no frantic last stand. Instead, you can almost see it, families packing up, one by one, glancing back at plazas now quieter than they remembered. The legends they carried with them faded, stories of a city swallowed by sand and memory, until even those whispers were lost to time. And so Carral slumbered, its pyramids and plazas gently tucked beneath the dunes, its flutes and drums silenced, waiting for someone to listen again. For nearly 4,000 years, Carral lay hidden, a secret cradled by the Supe Valley. Travellers passed the rounded mounds and never guessed that beneath their feet was a city older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than Babylon's towers. To them, the lumps were just desert quirks, nature's attempt at landscaping. If only they'd known they were walking over the ancient equivalent of a forgotten metropolis, an archaeological version of stumbling into a ghostly Times Square, minus the billboards and street performers. It wasn't until the late 20th century that Carral's voice, muffled but insistent, finally reached modern ears. Enter Ruth Shady, Peruvian archaeologist, and, I'd argue, honorary member of the secret society of historical fixers. In the 1990s, driven by hunches and hints, she led her team into the Supe Valley, determined to see if these odd hills hid more than just sand and disappointment. What they uncovered would turn history on its head. Layer by painstaking layer, the team brushed away centuries of dust. I watched as the outlines of walls emerged, stones set with a precision that would make any modern builder blush. Then came staircases, amphitheatres, and most astonishing of all, pyramids. Yes, pyramids. Not just one, but several, their weathered faces staring up at the sky as if in silent protest against their long obscurity. It was a city, an honest-to-goodness urban sprawl, built before most of the world had even figured out bricks. Radiocarbon dating delivered the real thunderclap. Carral was over 4,600 years old. That meant it was thriving at the same time as the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, the pyramid builders of Egypt, the earliest Chinese dynasties. In one swoop, Carral shattered old certainties about the Americas that civilization here was a late arrival, a footnote to the Old World's grand parade. Suddenly, the Americas had their own ancient marvel, a civilization born in parallel, not in shadow. But Carral's secrets didn't stop with stone and scale. Among the ruins, Shady and her team found the relics of daily life, musical instruments carved from bird bones, fishing nets woven from cotton, vibrant textiles, quipu, those enigmatic knotted cords that served as records and communication. There were offerings to the gods carefully buried, as if the ancient residents hoped their prayers would echo through the ages. Every artifact whispered of a people who valued creativity, community, and connection, a society that built not for war, but for celebration, ritual, and the quiet magic of living together. Carl's rediscovery was more than an archaeological coup. It was, in every sense, a resurrection. After millennia of silence, the city stood revealed once again beneath the open sky. The wind, which had once carried music and laughter, now tugged at the edges of exposed plazas and pyramids, as if urging the stones to speak their truths. Today, Carol is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a fragile, invaluable link to humanity's first experiments in dreaming big. The sands had hidden Carol well, but the stones endured. They waited, not for conquerors or kings, but for listeners, for those willing to stop and ask, how did this place so advanced and harmonious simply disappear? The question still burns, as insistent as the desert sun. Corral's lesson is a sobering one. Even the wisest, most peaceful societies are but threads woven into time's tapestry, always at the mercy of change, both subtle and seismic. And yet, what a thread it is. Corral stands today as a silent giant, its pyramids and plazas echoing with the memory of a civilization that defied the usual script. There are no scenes of conquest here, no murals of battle. Instead, Corral offers a vision of greatness built on harmony, ingenuity, and hope. Long before the empires of Greece, Rome, or even Egypt's pharaohs, the people of Corral were raising pyramids without the wheel, mapping the stars without written language, weaving communities rooted in trade, music and ritual, all with a remarkable absence of bloodshed. Take that, history textbooks. Carol's story interrupts our expectations. It's a gentle rebuke to the idea that civilization must be born in violence, that progress is measured in the spoils of war. Here was a city that valued knowledge over domination, connection over conquest. Complexity, it turns out, doesn't require armies. It needs only the collective dream of a people determined to build, to celebrate, to reach for something greater than themselves. And Corral's legacy stretches far beyond the Supe Valley. It challenges the old narrative that civilization sprouted from a single cradle, that the Americas lagged behind the old world. Corral proves that humans, no matter where they started, shared a restless spirit, the drive to endure, to create, to reach toward the divine. Innovation, aspiration, and survival are not the property of any one continent. If you ever find yourself wandering among Corral's weathered stones, pause and listen. You might just hear it, the distant pulse of drums, the low, sweet sigh of flutes, the good-natured squabble of traders in the plaza, and the echo of children's laughter beneath a sky crammed with stars. Their dreams, their struggles, their midnight complaints about cold stone floors and sand in unfortunate places, they're all still here, etched into the bones of the earth. Carol teaches us that even when civilizations fall, their spirit can endure, sleeping beneath the sands, waiting for rediscovery, ready to inspire another age. In the grand, messy timeline of human history, Carol shines not as a silent relic, but as a quiet beacon for the future, a reminder that, even in the harshest deserts, the seeds of wonder, wisdom, and peace can take root and, given patience, grow into something extraordinary. So next time you grumble about your Wi-Fi dropping out or your takeout arriving cold, remember Carol, a civilization that reached for the stars with nothing but reed flutes, clever hands, and a hope that their story would one day be heard again. And thanks to a little sand, a lot of patience, and some dedicated time-traveling fixers, it has.